Section 29 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 1, The Reign of Terror, Part 2. Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1792, was a fine day, agreeable weather, notes Gouverneur Morris. But the sunshine looked black enough in Paris, for the news came that morning of the fall of Verdun. The Prussians were 6 days' march from the capital. Dumouriez with his army was on the front in the north. Between the Prussians and Paris there was only Kellerman with his little army of volunteers. I would not for the world palliate the massacres of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th of September. They, after the St. Bartholomew, are the deepest stain on the glorious robe of France. But we in our own days know the madness induced by spy fever, and the political prisoners in the jails of Paris were reckoned as conspirators and spies. I would not say that Danton designed and ordered those massacres, but it is clear he did nothing to prevent them. C'est moi qui ai tout fait, he said to the Duke of Chartres. Que m'importe d'être appelé buveur de sang, he cried to the convention. It was no popular movement, but a got-up affair, wrote another demagogue, Robert Lindet. It is probable that the Commune set the riot in movement, and Danton, Minister of Justice, moved no finger when the Commune's paid murderers broke into the prisons of Paris, and in 5 days' steady work assassinated between 1,200 and 1,600 political prisoners. For the thing suited his book, and probably they were spies. Non ragionum di lor. If every great movement has its good and its bad angel, then on the slopes of the Argonne a voluntary sacrifice attested the nobler spirit of the revolution. On the little hill of Valmy, under their new tricolour flag, Kellerman's volunteers in their wooden shoes and rough blue jackets rushed on the Prussians to the strains of the Marseillaise, shouting "Vive la Nation!" They carried the day. When, on the following Saturday, the Republic, one and indivisible, came legally into being with the vote of the new Assembly, the Prussian army in retreat had turned its banners toward the Rhine. The Austrians were still in the north. No peace had confirmed the retirement of the Prussians, and France was still on the verge of civil war, without an ally, without money or munitions, with an improvised army of ignorant volunteers. It was in these conditions that the Jacobins invented their splendid programme of reforms, which gave 14 armies to the Republic and made France once more the first great power in Europe. They had to invent to this end a system of policy not only novel in itself, but in disaccord with all their dearest theories. They had to improvise in the heat of battle a centralized government which was the pure negation of the sovereignty of the people, the rights of man, and individual liberty. They had, in the words of Marat, to oppose the despotism of freedom to the despotism of kings. On the very morrow of Valmy, the Jacobins of Paris, confronted with the dire need of finding and furnishing an adequate armed force for the defence of the territory, struck out a new conception of property. In their eyes, private wealth was no longer an intangible family heritage and personal satisfaction. It was, although entrusted to the temporary keeping of individuals, the last resource and the last reserve of the state, its forlorn hope, and as such, always liable to be required and requisitioned in any mortal extremity of the nation. In time of war, and especially in case of invasion, not a drop of French blood, not a coin of French gold could be esteemed private property. The country had a prior claim on all possessions. Industry, counsel, fortune, labour, these are gifts that most of us can bestow. We all can give our blood. Let each of us be found at his post. Let the young men fight. Let the fathers of families forget their arms and transport their ammunition, while the women sew their tents and their uniforms and nurse the wounded. The very children can make lint and fold a bandage. Henceforth our houses must all be barracks, our marketplaces workshops. The Republic is one great beleaguered city, and all of France a military camp. Such were the measures proposed by Barrère, the translator of Young's Night Thoughts, in the name of the Committee of Public Safety. Almost the first act of the Convention was to put the king upon his trial. If a legitimate king can be guilty of high treason to his revolting subjects, I suppose that Louis XVI was guilty. It is certain that he had summoned the foreigner into France, that he intrigued against the constitution he had accepted, but it was in defence of his life and his crown. From the first day of the trial it was clear that the Gironde desired to save the king. The Gironde was not, like the Mountain, a sect of fanatics with a dogma to enforce. The Mountain was a block. The Gironde was compact, of many varieties in one opinion. There were constitutionalists and there were republicans, but both alike upheld the earlier principles of the Revolution: the reverence for justice, the cult of law, the firm faith in the sovereignty of the people. The Constitution had declared the person of the king inviolable. Therefore, said the Girondins, even if the king has done wrong, it is impossible to behead the king without consulting on so grave a subject the sovereign people. They wished to go to the country to gain time, and were certain that a referendum would support their views. But the criterion of the Mountain was not law nor principle. They considered the present safety of the country, the salut public. It was expedient that one man should die for the people. They averred, and it is probable they were right, that a referendum could only result in civil war. Their one chance, they thought, was to intimidate royalists and constitutionalists alike, to threaten the Gironde, to throw down the gauntlet to all the monarchs of Europe, and by cutting off the head of a traitor king, Louis le Traître, as Barrère called him, to place between France and her invaders an irreparable crime, an obstacle to any possible pact or peace. You are not judges, you are and can be only statesmen. Vous n'êtes point des juges. Vous n'êtes et ne pouvez être que des hommes d'État, said Robespierre to the tribunal of the Convention. Caesar was stabbed in the Senate, and 22 dagger thrusts were judged a sufficient formality, remarked Saint-Just. What the Mountain wished was a coup d'état, boldly accepted, inspired by a political necessity. The Mountain said, as Danton had said in September, "I looked my crime straight in the face, and I chose it." This terrible doctrine of the salut public has always haunted the logical imagination of the French, and its apparitions have constantly heralded misfortune. The St. Bartholomew is the example that rises at once to one's mind, but there are earlier ones, such as the murder of the Knights Templar under Philippe le Bel, and later ones, for instance the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Last of all, there was the Dreyfus affair. The raison d'etat has always been the bane of France. End of section 29. Section 30 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 1, The Reign of Terror, Part 3. We have to consider, said Robespierre, not justice, but policy. There was calculation, as well as vengeance, anger, and conviction in the Jacobin onslaught on the king. Unfortunate Louis XVI. He was the bone of contention between two raging parties at the very moment when his patience, his serenity, his simplicity in unexampled reverses, for Charles I was never treated with quite the same brutality, began to endear him to the hearts of, at least, the common people. They had never seen the king so close at hand. The sentries on duty at the Temple were chosen from the town militia, the Garde Nationale, and constantly varied, lest familiarity favour a system of intrigues between the guards and the prisoners. In this way a considerable number of Parisians enjoyed their look at Louis. Michele, that ardent apostle of the Revolution, tells us that his father was one of these sentries of the Temple, and that he came away much impressed by the artless good nature and the ingenuity of Louis XVI. The tyrant seems a simple, easy sort of fellow, the Republican guards would say, a little mystified, as they watched the stout, hearty king give his little boy a lesson in geography or play a game of piquet to amuse his wife. No bitterness, no rancour showed in his demeanour, and if he had occasion to speak to his jailers, it would be to ask them news of their family, or to express in his natural way some simple sentiment or homely axiom which made them feel akin. On the 11th of December 1792, when the king's trial began, he was kept all day in court without food or drink. His huge Bourbon appetite, that nothing ever checked, tormented the poor prisoner. And as he drove homewards to his dungeon of the Temple, seeing one of his escort munch a chunk of bread, he asked the man for a bit of it. Chaumette, he was syndic of Paris, broke off a piece, of which Louis eagerly devoured the crust, and then held the crumb in his hand, not knowing what to do with it. Chaumette took it from him and threw it out of the window. The king looked surprised. "My grandmother," said Chaumette, "used to say, 'Never throw a crumb of bread. You couldn't make it grow.'" "Monsieur Chaumette," said the king, "your grandmother was a woman of great sense. Bread is the gift of God." And in this homely fashion the royal captive, already practically condemned to death, chatted with his Republican jailer on his way to his prison. A number of little traits of this sort became diffused among the people, and one may say that never since his youth had the Bon Roi been so popular as on the very eve of his execution. There was no time to lose. The Jacobins hurried on the fatal hour and overbore the passionate opposition of the Girondins. Robespierre was evidently anxious. He rejected the idea of an appeal to the people. For are not the virtuous always a minority? Saint-Just went further still. An appeal to the people, said he, might well be a revival of the monarchy. That which they had to do, they would do quickly. On the 21st of January 1793, Paris was declared in a state of siege. A great green close carriage, accompanied by a strong escort, led Louis XVI to the Place Louis XV, the present Place de la Concorde. There stood the scaffold. The king mounted the steps, and then rushed forwards, meaning to address the people. The officer in command of the troops ordered the drums to beat. The king then turned to us, wrote the executioner Samson, who has left his recollections of this great event, and said, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of that of which I am accused. May my blood cement the happiness of Frenchmen." And he composed himself to death. I do not know if the Abbé Edgeworth really said then the fine phrase with which he is credited, "Enfant de Saint Louis, montez au ciel." But it is certain that in that last scene the king, who had so constantly wished to prove himself a child of Henri IV, showed himself really and truly a son of Saint Louis. The death of the king rang the knell of the Gironde. The Girondins soon will be sent in droves to the scaffold, will be hunted from their hiding places in the woods with bloodhounds like runaway slaves, will know every form of misery and humiliation. The royalist risings in the south and west will only add an excuse to the reign of terror. The triumph of the Jacobins appears complete. As a firm lover of France, I cannot bring myself to write the innumerable lists of their victims. "Liberty," said Madame Roland, "what crimes are committed in thy name?" yet by their system of tyranny and sacrifice, by the way they centralized the energies of France, by their extermination of all possible resistance, and by the very terror they inspired, the Jacobins attained that which they attempted, which was to secure the future of their country. They left her great, really one and indivisible, defended by 14 armies comprising 1,200,000 men. While they mobilized men and money in defence of the country, in the teeth of all Europe against them, with the Prussians in the Vosges, the Spaniards threatening Bayonne, the Prince of Coburg in front of Maubeuge, 45,000 Austrians and Italians in the Alps, 50,000 Spaniards in the Pyrenees, more than 100,000 Austrians, Imperials, and English in Belgium and the Lower Rhine, 33,000 Austrians between the Meuse and the Moselle, 112,000 Germans on the Upper Rhine. With all these enemies and a federal insurrection in the south and west, these indomitable terrorists still found time and liberty of mind to invent a new form of social order, which, when at last the triumph of the Republic should ensure eternal universal peace, might, they thought, confer on mankind the gifts of unity, fraternity, and happiness. This new organization was in fact their Kultur. Robespierre was their thinker, but their prophet was Saint-Just, a young man of 24 in 1793, whose energy, passion, and genius, perhaps also his personal beauty and dark solemn dignity, had brought him already to the very summit of affairs, the Committee of Public Safety. Nothing seemed simpler to Saint-Just than, by a sequence of decrees expressed with tragic eloquence and enforced by terror, to change the very spirit of a nation, the character of a race, the tendency of an age. Saint-Just, with his fixed, sombre gaze under his narrow forehead, saw, as he thought, in front of him, across a brief river of blood, which he did not hesitate to ford, reach out immense and splendid, the golden age, when nobody should be poor, when all men should live equal. There should be no more rich. Opulence, said he, is infamy. Let every citizen possess his daily bread, a roof over his head, a clean and comely wife, healthy, robust children. Let him live in self-respecting independence. An organized democracy must furnish every citizen with that which he principally needs: work for the able, instruction for the child, assistance for the old and infirm. Between private persons the difference in the scale of living should be trifling. A slight degree should separate the maximum and the minimum. Much the same standard of comfort in every house, that of a well-to-do farmer or prosperous artisan. The children of all citizens between the ages of 5 and 12 shall be educated in common at the expense of the Republic. No Frenchman, said Robespierre, should possess in unearned increment more than 3,000 francs, £120, a year. There must be neither rich nor poor. We intend, said Marat, that every man who owns less than 100,000 francs, £4,000, shall be on our side, and feel that his interest lies in maintaining the Republic. If the rich will not share and share alike in the benefits of the Revolution, they are not of our family. We confiscated the estates of the émigrés because they would not share with us the perils of the Revolution. Egotism is the mortal sin, and private property is its aliment. These last words, which are Saint-Just's, sum up the doctrine of the Great Committee. But these opinions could not please those wealthy cities of the south, those opulent and cultivated bourgeois, who barely 4 years before had thrown themselves into the Revolution in order to secure a wider and unlimited field for their own development and their personal ambition. Thousands of bourgeois of Marseille, Bordeaux, Lyon, 6,000 inhabitants were sacrificed at Lyon, were beheaded, drowned in the Rhine, or shot, in order to expiate the crime of rebellion against the dogmatism of Robespierre and the communism of Saint-Just. The Republic, in its narrow, fiery limits, could not include both Jacobins and Girondins. One or the other must perish. They were incompatible. It was a death struggle between the Commune and the Convention, the centripetal and the centrifugal forces, and the issue appeared uncertain when the treason of Dumouriez, who commanded the French armies on the Belgian border, gave a fatal blow to the prestige of the Girondins. It was almost a slur on their honour, for Dumouriez on his recent visit to Paris, had been the constant guest and confederate of the Girondins. Who was to take his place? Lafayette, who commanded the armies of the centre, on learning the execution of the king, had shaken the dust of his country from his feet and was just setting forth for America, seeking, like Alceste, un endroit écarté, où d'être homme d'honneur en est la liberté, when on the very frontier he had been seized by the enemy and was now a military prisoner at Olmütz. Custine, another aristocrat, who had been sent to the north, had been beaten by the Prussians, recalled, beheaded, for such was the Jacobin way with a general not victorious, pour encourager les autres. Decidedly, the Girondins had no luck at all with their generals, whose incapacity or treason compromised the existence of France. The situation was terrible. The English were in Toulon. The army on the Rhine was retreating before the victors of Mayence. The Dutch and the English were masters of Valenciennes. The army of the north was at the mercy of the Austrians. Lyon was in open revolt. La Vendée was at war with the Republic. 2/3 of the departments were threatening insurrection. Meanwhile, in the capital, for Celts will be Celts, the question was less to be or not to be than which will carry the day, the Commune of Paris or the provincial deputies. The Jacobins at least took the situation seriously. On learning the danger of France, they decreed a levy of 300,000 men, a measure which was carried out in the provinces in the midst of protest, agitation, sometimes insurrection, and sometimes civil war. For in that age of professional armies, the obligation of military service appeared the most murderous form of tyranny. When the farmers of the south and the west saw their lads driven from the land in order to fight for a government who had cut off the head of the king, exiled the clergy, and who now, worse luck, threatened their own deputies, the members of their choice, they put their heads together and cogitated. Well, since fight they must, our sons shall fight for us. And they joined the men of Lyon, the Cevennes, La Vendée. Normandy, too, displayed disquieting symptoms. And in Paris, the Jacobins inaugurated a revolutionary tribunal which was to take a short way with traitors. As Robespierre explained, the tribunal will judge only one form of offence, high treason, for which there is only one punishment, death. It is therefore useless that time should be wasted in long deliberations. The Jacobins, the Commune, and the Mountain voted an enforced loan to be levied on the rich, repayable 3 years after the conclusion of peace. All these measures, requisition of men and money, revolutionary tribunal, even the Committee of Public Safety, were abominable in the eyes of the Gironde, who declared that France was about to witness a worse tyranny than that of Venice. The Girondin members appealed to the provinces. They felt themselves in imminent danger, and with them the laws and liberties of France. And Marat, the soul of the Commune, Marat, a lunatic crank inflamed with fever and political passion, or if you like it, as the Jacobins put it, Marat, ce philosophe formé par la méditation et le malheur, Marat declared, with his great blazing sunken eyes glowering at the Girondins, we must cut off 100,000 heads in order to save 24 millions of men. End of section 30. Section 31 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 1, The Reign of Terror, Part 4. The Girondins had appealed to the departments. Against them Robespierre, that apostle of unity, pronounced the word that was to ruin them without reprieve, federalism. Robespierre did not thunder like Danton or scream like Marat, but his clear, shrill voice enunciated calmly syllables that the ears of his listeners retained for ever. And it must be owned that in this, as in other things, Robespierre had a strange prevision of the future. As a thinker, at least, as a seer, he made few mistakes. On the eve of the 19th century that was to fight such glorious fights for the unity of North America, the unity of Italy, the unity of Germany, the unity of the Slavs, Robespierre saw, 60 years before the rest of us, the superannuated futility of the Girondins' federal ideal. He foresaw that, as he foresaw our terrible modern conception of the art and state of war. And he was equally ready to die for his dream or to drown in blood those who opposed it. No wonder the Girondins felt their blood run cold, or rather felt it run hotter than blood should run, for they were men of the fiery South, and the fieriest of them all, unhappily, was the president of the Convention. He was, again unfortunately, since Aquitaine mixes a sober dose of reason in its heady wine, no lawyer from Bordeaux like most of the Girondins, but a clever declamatory perfumer from Grasse in Provence. On the 27th of May, 1793, this man, Isnard, as president of the Convention, was required to receive a deputation from the Commune, and at the sight of his enemy his eloquence stole away his wits, and he declared, "Listen while I tell you. If ever in an odious desecration Paris should lay hands on the deputies of the nation, I declare to you in the name of France, Paris shall disappear from the face of the earth, and men shall seek in vain on which bank of the Seine Paris once used to exist." Robespierre and Marat had now their excuse. It was sacrilege in the eyes of the Commune to speak ill of Paris, the capital of liberty. Henceforth Isnard and all his comrades were hostages for the provinces. Robespierre washed his hands of them and their fate, saying in his plaintive way at the Society of Jacobins, "It is not for me to say how the people are to save the Republic. What is one man? It is not for me to indicate the necessary measures. I am ill. I am consumed by a slow fever, and especially by the fever of patriotism. I have said my say." The leader, with a sigh, sank into his seat, and the people of Paris, feeling the reins loose on their neck, rose in an obedient riot, invaded the Convention armed with pikes and rifles, and affirming their right to insurrection in their capacity of a sovereign people, demanded the proscription of 22 deputies. It is not easy to say why they fixed on this particular figure. There were in the Assembly a great many more than 22 Girondins. M. Roland estimates their number at 165. But those 22 were a sort of general staff, and besides, in one of those baseless libels disseminated by the party newspapers, which were at the origin of most of the excesses of Paris, had it not been written that the Gironde had supplied Dumouriez with a list of 22 Jacobins, whose heads were to fall the day when his armies should conquer the capital? The 22 escaped with their lives, banished from the Convention, banished from the capital. Some of them proceeded to Rouen. It was a favourite idea of theirs, as it had been of the King's, that the National Assembly of Deputies ought not to be exposed to the fret and fever of an excitable metropolis. The monarchy had governed from the stately quiet of Versailles. The Americans were even then founding a parliamentary city, named after George Washington, in the very centre of their states, and the Girondins had thought of Bourges, because it is situated in the centre of France. But the evident sympathies of the Normans for their cause had drawn them to Rouen, where they held a sort of informal congress to expound their views. and there they moved the patriotism and the passion of a young girl of noble instincts to such a fervour of pity and indignation that, keeping her own counsel, she left the city and took the coach for Paris. She was the great-granddaughter of Pierre Corneille, the tragic poet. A tragic solution came naturally to the mind of Charlotte Corday d'Armont. We all know how she bought a knife under the arcades of the Palais Royal, how she called at Marat's house, forced her way into his presence, and stabbed him in his bath. That was on the 13th of July. 4 days later she paid her debt under the sliding axe of the guillotine, happy because she thought that she had rid her country of a tyrant. Alas, she had only sent her friends the Girondins to the scaffold. The murder of Marat had maddened Paris, for Marat was the idol of the people. Cœur de Jésus, Cœur de Marat, prayed the Jacobins, and his bust was set on many a patriotic altar. We see the saints we adore through a magic prism which makes them resemble an image in our heart. It is difficult for us to comprehend the cultus of Paris for this pretentious and bloodthirsty lunatic, but to the men of the Terror, Marat appeared all pity, all power, all certitude of salvation, and in their ignorance they took the hair-brained doctor for a man of science, Marat, ce philosophe formé par la méditation et le malheur. The murder of a god exacts a bloody sacrifice. The Girondin deputies were tracked like wild beasts, imprisoned, beheaded. On the 3rd of October 12 of them were guillotined in Paris. At the other end of France, in their own Bordeaux, another half-dozen were guillotined. Some tried to escape. The corpse of Pétion was found in the fields, half eaten by dogs. Condorcet committed suicide. Almost all the personages mentioned in this narrative will come to the same violent end. The Queen, beheaded on the 15th of October, Madame Elisabeth a few months later, Chaumette, the syndic procureur of Paris, after his royal prisoner, Barnave regretting only, as he wrote to one of his sisters, the pleasures of friendship, et la culture de l'esprit, dont l'habitude a souvent rempli mes journées d'une manière délicieuse. And later, as the tragic whirligig went round, bringing new men up, sending others down, Danton, the giant of the Revolution, sacrificed by Robespierre, then Robespierre himself, Saint-Just. 2,500 persons were executed in Paris during the Terror, 5,000 drowned in the Loire at Nantes. At Lyons, the suspects were shot down in troops. A sad fatality, said Camille Desmoulins, one December evening at the Society of Jacobins. An unhappy fatality wills that out of 60 persons who witnessed my marriage contract, only 2 remain, Robespierre and Danton. All the rest are guillotined or have emigrated. Imprudent Camille, such reflections are not esteemed civic. Thy gifted featherhead will soon fall in the basket, soon to be joined by Robespierre and Dantons. When in its first glow of dawn the Republic had gladdened the world, its prophets had considered their new government in the light of a religion. The Republic was the successor of superannuated Christianity. The years should no longer be counted from the birth of Jesus Christ, but from the proclamation of the Republic. In the new year there were 12 months with, in each, 3 weeks, or decades of 10 days, with a sort of leap year surplus for Republican festivals. The year began with the Era, on the 22nd of September, 1792, the day of the autumnal equinox, and the months ran in their courses. Vendémiaire, the vintage month; Brumaire, the month of mists; Frimaire, of freezing; Nivose, the snow month; Pluviose, the time of rains; Ventose, the windy season; Germinal, when plants begin to germinate; Floréal, the month of flowers; Prairial, the time of hay fields; Mésidor, the harvest moon; Thermidor, the hot season; Fructidor, the season of fruits. Of all these lovely names, only 2 are still frequent on our lips. We still speak of Thermidor and Brumaire because of the great political events with which they are associated. A nation cannot lose, by Act of Parliament, the mental habit of many centuries. In France, in any difficulty, Frenchmen naturally turned toward the king. In 1793, when all Europe fell on France, while in her own boundaries there raged a war of secession, even the Republicans looked instinctively for some strong man, some anax andron, to appear and deliver. The Girondins had called Marat before the bar of his peers because he had cried that France needed a chief, a military tribune. In August 1793, in the Society of Jacobins, another orator arose and announced the advent of a Messiah, le grand homme qui doit paraître, qui sauvera son pays et donnera la paix en assurant le bonheur du monde. At that moment, sick of anarchy, the eyes of France turned towards Robespierre. That spick-and-span, elegant, slim, and gentle figure appeared no less than the wild, filthy, raving Marat, the expected angel of deliverance. So deep was the need of a saviour. But Robespierre was incapable of impulse or daring. In opposition to most historians, I believe that Robespierre was perfectly sincere and perfectly well-intentioned, but, wrapped in his vision and his system, his imagination lacked the human touch that made Danton, for instance, passionately aware of the horror of his crimes. Robespierre saw the world as a tissue of numbers and maxims and systems. Of all the blood he shed, no warm drop splashed up in his eyes or stained his heart. Was this unpleasant operation necessary for the infinite advantage of humanity? He thought it was, and esteemed himself an apostle and a benefactor, while Danton, disgusted with his own blood-guiltiness, exclaimed, "J'aime mieux être guillotiné que guillotineur." Robespierre, gazing into the future, smiled ecstatically and murmured, "Encore quelques serpents à écraser." Those last serpents crushed, he felt the millennium at hand. The odd thing is that Robespierre should have been popular, as he certainly was. More than once, between the summer of '93 and the summer of '94, Paris threw herself at his feet and would fain have thrown herself into his arms. Robespierre was apparently shocked. He considered these advances as an improper proposal. The only use he made of his power was to exterminate heresy, and that with such ruthless vigour that at last the very city that had adored him felt her gorge rise at the sight of those clear green eyes, at the sound of that clear keen voice, always demanding blood, more blood, turned from him with loathing and sent him to join the thousands he had slaughtered. On the 9th of Thermidor in the year II, on the 27th of July 1794, the reign of terror came to an abrupt end. Robespierre, Saint-Just, and their companions were sent to the guillotine by an unexpected revolt and coup d'état of their confederates. And on the morrow, on the morning of the 10th of Thermidor, when the deputies of the Convention left the Tuileries, they were hailed with the shouts of a crowd delirious with joy. Women threw roses at them as they passed. Young men seized the skirts of their coats and lifted them to their impassioned lips. The men of the moment, new names, Tallien, Fréron, Barras, looked at each other in surprise. They had guillotined their old accomplice, Robespierre, as a matter of political necessity, and doubtless had intended to continue an excellent method for securing a majority. But being neither men of genius like Danton, men of character like Saint-Just, nor men of absolute and reasoned conviction like Robespierre, but just opportunists and men of politics, they grasped the situation in a twinkling. So mercy was to be the order of the day. They welcomed an idea which decided that Robespierre's avengers could not anew pretend to place and power. Henceforth the Jacobins were fallen from grace, and a certain Thibaudeau writes in his memoir, "On semblait sortir du tombeau et renaître à la vie." End of section 31. Section 32 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 2. The Coming of Bonaparte, Part 1. A year after the reaction of Thermidor, the Republic was again on the eve of civil war. The fall of Robespierre had removed that soul of tense republican energy which had created armies, organized victory, and governed a country in circumstances of unparalleled distress. And now, in a relaxing of every fibre, a general indifference and indolence, a longing for pleasure and luxury and wealth, seemed suddenly to invade the strenuous nation, to set it smiling and trifling and dreaming, with its enemies still in the gate. A new class had arisen: speculators and stock jobbers, estate agents, contractors, especially army contractors, enriched with the spoils of the Revolution, and much inclined to think, after the manner of a certain pope, that since God had seen fit to give them the Republic, they would enjoy it. France had disarmed 3 of her foes and had enlarged her borders. In 1795 the Peace of Bâle made Spain her ally, while Prussia yielded her the left bank of the Rhine. Peace with Holland followed. In 3 years France had added to her territory 9 new departments, had gained the Rhine and Belgium, had filled out her natural limits. Those 3 years had done more than the 3 preceding centuries. In blaming the crimes of the Convention, let us remember its benefits. The Romans of old forgave much to the conqueror, who enlarged the circuit of the city. The Republic had expanded the Pamoirium of France. Within doors, too, the Convention had not been idle, had elaborated a scheme of popular education, had founded most of the great public colleges that exist today: École Normale, Polytechnique, Saint-Cyr, Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers. At once beneficent and criminal, the Convention had let no sacrifice and no scruple divert it from its task. But it had ruled with an absolute power, a rod of iron, and tyranny, whether it be of a king or a Convention, soon exhausts the gratitude of those who benefit from its exactions. So now the heroic and terrible Convention, come to its natural term of 3 years, was expiring amid the impatience of a public eager to get rid of it, a public in love with mediocrity. But the Convention could not accept its end. Chiefly from love of power, and partly, no doubt, from patriotism, it clung to office. Remembering the disorganization which had followed its own election, when no single deputy had any experience of affairs, the Convention issued a decree. 2/3 of the members of the new Legislative Assembly were to be chosen from its body. The Royalists and Girondins greeted this audacious fiat with shouts of rage. Down with the assassins! Death to the Commune! Down with the Terror! While the democratic sections of the city openly threatened a counter-revolution, and spoke of the right of the sovereign people to change the form of its government at its own sweet will, as often as it pleased. The Convention which had sent Louis XVI to the scaffold, which had beheaded Marie Antoinette, which had exterminated the Girondins, and sacrificed its own leaders, Danton, Robespierre, Saint-Just, was now in its turn menaced with the customary fate of tyrants. But the terrorists of yesterday were men of resolution. They meant to die hard and fight in self-defence. Aware that Paris intended to attack them at their next meeting, the Convention prepared itself to stand a siege. Barras, one of the leaders, remembered a young, small, sombre Corsican officer who had brilliantly recovered Toulon from the English. He sent for this young general Bonaparte, for thus they wrote his name, and so Napoleon enters our field of vision. He was 26 years of age, ignorant, original, full of projects and ideas, what the Germans call a world mender, a Weltverbesserer. Nothing ever astonished me so much as to see Monsieur Bonaparte win battle after battle, said a French officer of the old school to Stendhal in Berlin. He talked so much. I expected nothing from a man so full of interminable discussions. He wished to reform everything in the state. Except in military tactics, the practice of artillery, mathematics, Rousseau's theories, and Plutarch's Lives, Napoleon, though a great reader, was no scholar. He had little Latin and less Greek. He was singularly ill-instructed even in the recent discoveries of science. But he was a logical dreamer, and, as I have said more than once, that is the sort which does great things in France. He talked when occasion occurred to expatiate on his special hobby, but he was capable of infinite silence and self-absorption. He talked, but he had no small talk, and even when eloquent he often looked silent. His gaze was so sombre and so fixed. This profound inward glance struck every observer who has left us his impression of the young Napoleon. But for its beauty, he would have seemed but an ugly little man, so meagre, so painfully wasted, so sallow, with a great shock of unkempt brown hair hanging in untidy spaniel's ears over his cheeks and down below his chin. Altogether too much hair, said a lady who liked him to Stendhal, for so much eyes. And yet, to an artist's thinking, those wasted, drawn features, those great grey eyes so deeply sunk under the frontal arch, held the promise of classic beauty, especially the chiselled mouth. There was little of the soldier about him, said Stendhal's informant, nothing military, martial, loud, or dashing. He looked desperately poor, but then he was paid in paper money. I think we might have read even then in the contour of his exquisite lips that he despised danger, and that danger never made him lose his self-command. This lady may have been Lord Permont, Duchesse d'Abrantes. The portrait is so like her description of the Napoleon she knew from his youth up. Or was she Madame Victorine de Chassenay? Her account corroborates E. de Neuville, who a few years later noticed Bonaparte as a shabby, untidy little man, something like a clerk or an usher, petit, maigre, les cheveux collés sur les tempes, un air de négligence extrême. Utterly insignificant, until he transfixed you with that piercing, investigating, penetrating gaze no man ever forgot. A recent controversy in the Times has discussed the question of Napoleon's height. He seems to have been just over 5 feet 6 inches in stature, counting English inches. The old French pied and pouce are not the same. 5'6" is not very small for a southerner, and yet Napoleon is always spoken of as a little man. But he was ill-proportioned, the bust too long for his legs, and even in youth he stooped and poked his head. He was then as much too spare as in later life he became too corpulent for his height. We remember how little Lord Permont, when first she saw him in uniform, laughed at his scraggy shanks emerging from the wide tops of his immense Hessians, and how her sister dubbed the young lieutenant Puss in Boots. Dans sa jeunesse, she says elsewhere, Napoleon était laid. His sallow skin, yellow, almost grey, and his drawn thin features made this ugliness. As he grew stouter and stronger, the complexion warmed to a pleasant ivory, agreeable to the sight, although to a practised eye its utter colourlessness might have foretold that malady of the digestion which had killed his father, and which will leave our hero barely another 25 years into which to crowd his ample destiny. A nervous jerk of the right shoulder, frequent in moments of excitement or emotion, as well as something emaciated, fatal, avid, sombre in the whole aspect of the man, made him seem marked out for a tragic, not for a glorious destiny. His appearance foreshadowed St. Helena, not the Empire. Such was the man whom Barras summoned to rescue the deputies of France. At this period young Bonaparte was still a Jacobin. The younger Robespierre had been his friend. He had admired Maximilien. It is probable that in his heart of hearts he sympathized with the sections, a sort of town councils, of Paris rather than with these two prehensile deputies. Still, they represented authority, and they had sent for him. It was his chance, that opportunity which a prompt genius seizes by the forelock. He considered a moment and said that he must have cannon. Where was there a battery? There was one, he was told, just outside Paris at the park of Sablon, but it was thought that the local militia of the sections was already in possession. "We must have it," remarked our young man, mused a moment, and dispatched a friend of his in the cavalry, a young daredevil called Murat, full speed to Sablon at the head of a company of chasseurs. Murat routed the bourgeois of the Garde Nationale and brought 40 cannon back to Paris, which Bonaparte installed all round the Tuileries. That expedition was to bring them each a crown. On the morrow, 13th Vendémiaire, in the year 3, 5th of October, 1795, 40,000 Gardes Nationaux attacked the Tuileries. In those days there was no Rue de Rivoli. Few streets, and very narrow, led from the Rue Saint-Honoré to the palace and the gardens. In one of these narrow passages Bonaparte established a battery that swept the steps of Saint-Roch. The front of that church still shows the scars of the bullets that stopped the rush of the sections in that direction. Another battery commanded the Rue de Richelieu, a third the bridge and the quays of the south bank. By nightfall the insurrection was suppressed, and a few days later the grateful Convention appointed the little Corsican to be general-in-chief, commanding the armies of the interior, that is to say, all those not engaged in the invasion of Europe. Such a position, says Napoleon in his Memoirs, is not suitable to a general of 25. Before the ensuing spring was in full flower, the government granted the desire of his heart. In March 1796 he was sent to command the armies in Italy. The bridegroom, 5 days old, of a beautiful woman whom he passionately adored, he left Paris, his eyes blind with tears, but his heart all on fire with the lust of conquest. Prussia and Holland had laid down their arms and had yielded their claims to the left bank of the Rhine. But Austria, the Empire, the ally of yesterday and now the enemy of France, was obstinate in maintaining her sovereignty. The struggle of France with Austria had filled the history of centuries. The alliance had been a trifle of less than 40 years. It had never been popular. It had never seemed natural. And when the Gironde had declared war on Austria in 1792, the opening of hostilities had been greeted with national enthusiasm. Now, after 4 years of battles, Austria and England still held out. The Republic sent one army to invade the Empire. Another, under Bonaparte, was dispatched across the Alps. England must wait her turn. End of section 32. Section 33 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 2, The Coming of Bonaparte, Part 2. It was classic to attack the Empire in Italy. Over and over again we have seen the French armies take that road, invade Lombardy. But now the aim at least was different, more precise. The French Revolution was nourished on Roman history. It was Danton who first, reviving that old dream of Richelieu's, had answered the invasion of France by a coalition of kings with the assertion of his country's right to have her natural frontiers, that is to say, the limits of Gaul, the sea, the ocean, the Pyrenees, the Alps, and the Rhine. In 1792 the Executive Council had assigned the Rhine as the boundary of the Republic, and now these natural frontiers were a word to conjure with. No Frenchman would have less. Belgium, Savoy, Alsace were necessaries of life. And Bonaparte remembered Cisalpine Gaul. He would not only vanquish Austria, but create an allied republic in Lombardy to protect Savoy. Another in Holland would ensure the safety of Belgium. The great idea of Bonaparte, which he had received from the men of the Mountain, was to recover for the Republic l'héritage des Gaulois, the full inheritance of Gaul. The wonderful thing is that he did it in a few weeks. Who can read without emotion the series of his bulletins from Lombardy? The campaign in Italy began on the 10th of April, 1796. Napoleon proclaims from the summit of the Alps, "Soldiers, you are naked, half starved. The government owes you much and can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage in the midst of these rocks are splendid, but will get you no glory. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities shall fall into your hands. Soldiers of Italy, do you lack the courage or the constancy to conquer them?" Another bulletin is dated the 26th. "Soldiers, in 15 days you have gained half a dozen victories. You have taken 21 flags, 55 cannon, and several fortresses. You have conquered the richest territory in Piedmont, made 15,000 prisoners. You have killed or wounded 10,000 of the enemy. But, soldiers, you have done nothing, since you have still so much to do. As yet we possess neither Milan nor Turin." 3 weeks later he writes to Carnot, "The battle of Lodi gives Lombardy to the Republic. You may consider me at Milan." One more move on this marvellous chessboard, and there he was. The neat dispatch is dated, "From our general headquarters at Milan, 5 Prairial an 4, 24th of May, 1796. In those incoherent reminiscences and notes which Stendhal chose to entitle The Life of Napoleon, we find a living picture of the French occupation of Milan. Youth, glory, hope, joy, enthusiasm, beauty composed its colours. General Bonaparte was 26, and he was one of the oldest of us, says Stendhal. Never was an army so young or so gay, never was an army so ragged or so poor, so enchanted with a pair of new boots or a suit of clean linen, when the wealth of Lombardy began to roll into those empty pockets. The general had sent for his bride and his sisters, who reigned at Montebello and at the Palazzo Serbellone. But his young officers were dazzled by the high combs, the lace mantillas, the dark eyes, the mysterious insinuating smile of the ladies of Lombardy, who, in hatred of the Austrians, received their invaders with open arms. Those were days of love and war. At the entry of the French into Milan, the whole populace shouted one immense "Evviva!" All the lovely Lombard ladies were on their balconies, showering roses and kisses. Beyond the Spanish ramparts of the city, the plain in its fresh green stretched out for leagues, so covered with trees it appeared a forest, and in the distance the chain of the Alps, glittering with snow from Monte Viso to Monte Rosa, reared their sparkling summits in the hot blue sky. Rising out of the gardens near at hand, the lacy whiteness of the cathedral's marble dome appeared a reflection of that Alpine splendour. The spring of 1796 was the romance of the Revolution. The hour and the man had met. Marat's military tribune, the grand homme whom the Jacobins had prophesied, whose advent would bring le bonheur au monde, had appeared on the scene. Bonaparte occupied the horizons of Europe. The Republic of Lombardy soared into freedom and happiness without a struggle. Everywhere the Austrians were put to flight. The campaign of Rivoli lasted just 4 days. On the evening that followed the victory, one of the French generals, faint with fatigue, came up to Bonaparte. Napoleon pointed to a great heap of Austrian flags which were being brought in from every quarter and flung down at his feet. "Make your bed there, Lasalle," he said, "and rest. You have earned it." And the tired hero slept on his bed of trophies. But Bonaparte seemed never to rest from victory. Meanwhile, in France, another new constitution had changed in some respects the form of government. There was a chamber called the 500, there was a senate, the Conseil des Anciens, and the supreme board of 5 pentarchs united in a directory. Such was the body of the last revolutionary constitution. It had no soul. While the armies breathed youth, joy, and heroism, the civil state seemed in a condition of collapse. General indifference attended its transactions. The taxes brought in nothing to the empty treasury. The assignats had reached their lowest depth. If we open some old account book of the period, the prices fill us with amazement. Bread is 60 francs a pound. White beans 1,400 francs the bushel. In paper money, of course. Any other sort is scarce and most remunerative to its possessor. The louis d'or of 24 francs is worth 12,000 francs in assignats. Such was the condition of France after 8 years of revolution, when Bonaparte began to send his millions of Italian gold to Paris. War indemnities squeezed from Parma and Piacenza. English booty snatched from the harbour of Leghorn. Pictures and provinces wrung from the Pope. After Mantua, he sent 30 millions of francs in gold to the Minister of Finance in Rome, pour le soulagement du trésor public, enriched the museums of the capital with more than 300 masterpieces, which it had taken 30 centuries to produce, flew the French colours on the borders of the Adriatic, established 2 republics, filials of France, across the Alps, and brought into the French alliance Parma, Sardinia, Naples, and the Pope. The Treaty of Campo Formio, 1797, showed Austria vanquished, and flattered the passionate opposition of the French to the hated nation. For the France of the Revolution, which in more things than one returned to the traditions of Louis XIV, believed that France should never be free while Austria was prosperous. At Campo Formio, Austria, sorely against her will, accepted the new doctrine of the natural frontiers. The left bank of the Rhine and Belgium, which the victorious armies of the Republic held in their possession, and acknowledged the Republic of Lombardy. But Bonaparte had to grant the Emperor something in exchange. I think that which he sacrificed was his honour. He offered up unoffending Venice. He took what lay readiest to his hand without thought of right or wrong. Here we catch the first peep of the Corsican ogre familiar to our fathers, of that Napoleon who in 1799 will massacre 1,200 Turkish prisoners at Jaffa, though they surrendered to his parole, because he has no means of feeding or guarding them, who in 1804 will assassinate the Duke of Enghien, who during the terrible stampede of the retreat from Russia will abandon his wounded, the Napoleon who frankly owned one day to Josephine, "Les lois de morale et de convenance ne peuvent être faites pour moi." On this occasion he quietly wrote to the Directory, "Venise payera le Rhin," and all parties except Venice appeared satisfied with the transaction. Bonaparte reigned in Italy. When he returned to France covered with laurels, followed by the train of his spoils and conquests, it was evident that the victorious general, although no member of the government, was the only popular potentate in France. The Directory, whose existence he had assured, whose means of livelihood he had supplied, looked askance at this too brilliant benefactor. But Bonaparte did not yet wish to reign. The pear was not yet ripe. England had not made peace. End of section 33. Section 34 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 2, The Coming of Bonaparte, Part 3. Just as Napoleon had made war on Austria in Italy, he determined to engage England in Egypt prior to invading India. It is true that Egypt at that date belonged not to perfidious Albion but to Turkey, with whom France was no longer at war, but that was a detail. If the campaign in Italy had been the romance of the Revolution, the invasion of Egypt was its mystery, its aureole, its great adventure. Bonaparte set out for Alexandria, attended not only by a brilliant cohort of generals and 38,000 seasoned troops, but by the first mathematicians, geologists, chemists, and antiquaries of France. One of them, Champollion, discovered the key to the hieroglyphics of that elder world. For the first time since the Roman Empire, writes Napoleon, a civilized nation cultivating the arts and sciences was about to visit, measure, and explore the superb ruins which for centuries have dazzled the curiosity of science. And he enumerates his aeronauts, his poets, his astronomers and architects, capables de créer les arts de la France au milieu des déserts de l'Arabie. But when the soldiers of Bonaparte found themselves lost in those sterile wastes of sands with unfriendly Arabs, si laids, si féroces, and their women plus sales encore, for sole inhabitants, loud were their lamentations for the lovely plains of Lombardy. The army was struck by a vague melancholy which nothing could overcome. Because at every trace of antiquity the battalions halted, while the men of science measured, copied, dug, compared notes, the disgusted soldiers supposed that for this alone had they been called away from a fairer conquest, and in their chagrin they dubbed the asses of the transport men of science. But the day came when, about 5 leagues from Cairo, they saw 3 vast rocks rise on the flat horizon of the desert, and were told they had been raised by human hands. Though these were by far the most imposing monuments of the ancients that the troops had yet encountered, the architects and statuaries kept in the rear, and left the direction of affairs to the military officers. The soldiers were told to prepare for battle, and their next move was the victory of the pyramids. And now what wonderful names blaze like comets in the bulletins of Bonaparte: Alexandria, Jaffa, Nazareth. But while the soldiers on land went on from strength to strength, the English at Aboukir destroyed all the transport ships of the French, so that the victorious army was a prisoner in Egypt. The siege of Saint-Jean d'Acre was long and terrible, but even this repulse could be disguised as a triumph. The difficulties overcome, the dangers endured, the glory gathered, the rapidity of conquests which adorned the annals of France with the most splendid names of antiquity, all combined to increase the already dazzling reputation of a general barely 30. While in France, on all the frontiers, the government blundered into ruin through defeat, the public said to its soul, "Patience when Bonaparte comes home." Sidney Smith, the English admiral cruising off the coasts of Egypt, was a man endowed with the wisdom of the serpent. He arranged that a budget of newspapers full of all the disasters and defeats of the Directory should run the blockade and pass into the hands of General Bonaparte. In fact, with a perfidious courtesy, he gave them to a French officer come on board to parley concerning an exchange of prisoners. Bonaparte had been for 3 months deprived of news from home. When he saw the state of affairs in France, he determined to return at all risks. Rapidly and secretly he prepared his flight. A missive delivered only after his departure entrusted the army to General Kléber. There were 2 Venetian frigates in the port of Alexandria. Bonaparte, with several of his generals and 2 of the inseparable mathematicians, went on board, and after an adventurous voyage of 6 weeks, escaped the enemy scouring the seas in quest of all French vessels, and landed off the coast of Provence near Fréjus on the 17th Vendémiaire of the year 8. 2 days later the Directory at Paris received the news. It spread like wildfire. One name was on every lip: Bonaparte, Bonaparte, Bonaparte. Bonaparte had returned from Egypt to seize the reins of power. He meant to suppress the garrulous imbeciles of the Directory. But the country was still republican. he could not declare himself king. He was too young to be a director, had he aspired to a fraction of authority. And in 1799 the superstition of a plurality of rulers appeared the very sign and symbol of a democratic government. Bonaparte did not profit immediately by the wild enthusiasm that greeted his return. He lay low, frequented the sessions of the Institute, affected the character of the archaeologist, the pensive and travelling antiquary. Meanwhile he studied the public. The great majority of Frenchmen were weary of the Revolution's perpetual misrule, and yet, as I have said, remained attached to its benefits. There was little desire for the king to come to his own again. The situation of the poor, especially in country places, was on the whole immensely improved. We have it on the testimony of the Duke of La Rochefoucauld-Liancourt, among others, a witness the more disinterested that he was a man whom the Revolution had ruined, in his letters to his friend Arthur Young. He notes the social changes brought about by the new state of things. Large estates have given place to very small ones, which yield at least 1/4 more harvest and produce than the old. Agriculture is everywhere more intelligent. The homes of the peasants are improved, more spacious and cleaner. The labourers themselves are less ignorant than their fathers. Ils sont plus que, en état de réfléchir, de combiner, un peu moins éloignés de toute innovation. The sale of the church lands and of the estates confiscated from the émigrés had enriched a world of thrifty peasants, who dreaded any change in the government, lest they should be ordered to disgorge. The love of property, and not the love of liberty, riveted them to the Revolution. It seems a paradox to say that the French are no great lovers of liberty, but they are enthusiasts for equality. Justice, and not freedom, is really their national idol. The whole country would have risen in revolt rather than permit the re-establishment of the 3 orders and the privileges of aristocracy. They were ready to obey a master, should he be just, should he maintain equality among his subordinates, and confirm their possession of the fields and farms they had bought so cheap with their assignats. Bonaparte saw his way clear. The most absolute of mortals prepared to consolidate a great democracy. He knew that he had a party in the state, the army, at least the younger generals, the Senate, all that stood for authority and discipline, all that dreaded a threatening revival of the reign of terror. And in fact, only the Terror or a Caesar could have saved France at that juncture. But the Chamber, the Cinq Cents, was against a dictator, was for the greater part violently Jacobin. Appearances must be preserved. It was not as yet a question of mounting a horse, leading a charge, and issuing a pronunciamento. At last the plan was evolved. The Senate suddenly informed the nation of a vast conspiracy against the Republic. The 2 chambers were transferred to Saint-Cloud, a few miles outside Paris, to deliberate in peaceful seclusion, and Bonaparte was named general-in-chief, protecting the menaced legislators in the suburbs with a girdle of regiments and cannon. 3 of the 5 directors resigned, more or less spontaneously. The Cinq Cents and the ancients were requested to decide on a reform of the government. The day was fixed, the 9th of November, 1799, but history knows the date as the 18 Brumaire. It was fine. All Paris, at least all political Paris, set out for Saint-Cloud. One might have supposed that in the course of the last 10 years the Parisians had been surfeited with changes in the constitution. But in that case, too, it seems, that appetite grows by what it feeds on. The palace and the gardens were crammed. On the first floor the Senate was assembled. On a raised ground floor in the orangerie the 500 held council, draped in their red robes of office. Everyone guessed that something momentous was about to happen. No one, not even Bonaparte, knew exactly what was in the air. The general's brother, Lucien Bonaparte, was president of the Cinq Cents. But as time dragged on and nothing happened, Napoleon, always of a nervous temperament, chafed at the suspense and felt he must act himself. Suddenly he entered the orangery. He was greeted by a storm of abuse. Red sleeves flapped and struck him, half stifled him, for he was small. One giant of a deputy nearly knocked him down, and violent voices shrieked, "Down with the tyrant! Down with the dictator!" For one long moment he must have thought that all was lost. The grenadiers rushed in to save their general and carried him off, while still in angry tumult the Jacobins shouted, "Outlaw him! Outlaw him! Hors la loi!" But the day was not yet done. "Soldiers, can I count on you?" cried Bonaparte. Despite their cries of affirmation, neither master nor men knew at this juncture what to do next. There was a long moment of hesitation, and then Lucien Bonaparte appeared. He was, as I have said, the president of the 500, and seemed to incarnate the assembly. By this time General Bonaparte was on horseback. In a twinkling his brother was mounted and riding at his side. "Soldiers," said Lucien, "the president of the Council of the 500 assures you that the great majority of the Council is tyrannized and terrorized by a handful of dangerous assassins. Will you deliver the representatives of France? Those brigands in the orangery are not the deputies of the nation, but the deputies of the dagger." On this occasion it must be owned that the younger of the Corsican brothers was the more eloquent. He gave the army what it wanted, an excuse for its intervention. The drums beat, a column was formed, and a tumult of cries. As if by magic the daredevil Murat appeared and marched them up the shallow stairs leading to the orangery. Down with the Jacobins! Down with 93! The spirit of Thermidor was in the air. In the orangery the beat of the drums had struck a sudden terror. The door opened. Murat entered in a crowd of soldiers with fixed bayonets. This apparition had a very different effect from that of the solitary Bonaparte. In one instant the windows were open, they were but a few feet above the soft earth of the flower beds underneath, and the red togas were lost to view in the gloom of a November twilight. Tags and tatters of them were found on the morrow clinging to the thickets of the forest of Saint Cloud, and even in the woods of Meudon. The people of Paris only laughed and said, "The deputies have added another to the famous cascades of Saint Cloud." And on the very morrow a new government was formed, and the long reign of the Jacobins was brought to an end. There were no longer 5 directors, but 3 consuls. The first consul during the 10 years of his office was to rule the state. He named the ministers, controlled the administration, and called the policy. And the first consul, of course, was Bonaparte. His colleagues were neither rivals of his power nor critics of his policy, but they were very useful underlings, men of capacity and experience, well chosen, for he chose them himself, to support and enlighten a man of genius in a strange position. They were Napoleon's books of reference, indispensable, humble auxiliaries. Bonaparte was now the master of France. Too proud to owe his elevation to a November night's dream, he determined to make broad the basis of his power. He referred his new constitution to the nation. The people were asked to vote in approbation or repudiation of the new regime. 3 millions answered yes. There were only 1,500 nays. We hear of no revolt against the violent establishment of the new government. The Republic had entered into being with the thunderclap of a coup d'état, and it was an axiom of the Revolution that only by such means could the state in its distress be saved. The right of insurrection, the direct appeal to popular force, was in the eyes of Bonaparte's contemporaries the supreme safeguard against tyranny or mismanagement or corruption. In such circumstances the nation not only excused but required a coup d'état, or, as they said, a journée, a day's work. And soon, in the opinion of the majority, Brumaire was classed as a good day's work. No one regretted the effete and miserable government of the Directory. The state now was in a firm hand. Napoleon begins to bud in Bonaparte. End of section 34. Section 35 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 3, Napoleon, Part 1. Napoleon, First Consul, resembles the Emperor Napoleon only as the larva of some bright insect is like its future gorgeous self. The consul was a man of peace. He was a great administrator. No man ever mastered so thoroughly the minutest machinery of government. He was Sully and Colbert and Necker in one. A great financier, too, the ruined France of the Directory became prosperous under his management, and one of the legislators of all time. He considered the Code Napoleon his most enduring monument, and indeed the others have fallen like the flowers of the field. As head of the state, he was careful not to offend the democratic sentiment of the French. His first act is a plébiscite, which grounds his government on the consent of the people. He is scrupulous not to overstep his privilege, and sometimes exasperates Cambacérès, the second consul, who remembers the speedier methods of the Convention, by the care with which he refers any administrative measure to the control of the Council. Never a ruler more circumspect than he, more eager to profit by the experience of the great political bodies, the Senate, the Council of State. With them he undertakes the task of definitively reorganizing France, and elaborates a constitution which in its essentials has resisted more than one change of dynasty, because it has the qualities chiefly necessary in national affairs: solidity, simplicity, economy, and order. The Revolution, in its various attempts at a constitution, had organized the communes, the cantons, and the departments of France, but had not discovered the connecting link needed to attach the mechanism of provincial life to the vital centre, Paris. At one period during the Reign of Terror, the ubiquitous Société Populaire, established in every town, almost in every village of the Republic, had served as an efficient, if non-official, means of communication with the Jacobin government. But whether in town or country, the Jacobins now were in disgrace or non-existent. The local aristocracy had emigrated or perished on the scaffold. There was a gap between the consuls and the communes, a solution of continuity fatal to unity and order. Bonaparte revived the intendants, with a difference, instituted, I mean to say, in every department, a prefect, an agent charged with the supervision of all the affairs of a province, the collection and assessing of taxes, local expenditure, the administration of justice and police, the conduct of elections, the execution of the government's decrees, etc. The prefect is the vicar of the central power, the instrument of its will, and also the channel of its information. The first consul corrected what might seem too rigid in his system by a complete absence of political colour in the men he chose to work it. He cast his net very wide. If a man were a good administrator, he took him, were he Jacobin or Girondin, Feuillon or even aristocrat. A La Rochefoucauld was prefect of Seine-et-Marne, and the ex-Duke of Béthune-Charost one of the 12 mayors of Paris. Here we touch the secret of the success of Napoleon's administration. He took account of realities, not of theories. Nothing could be more unlike the absolute, the ferocious idealism of a Robespierre or a Saint-Just, which invented a system, doubtless excellent in cloud cuckoo land, and then applied it, relentless, to an actual society which, wrapped in the fervour of their dream, they never seem to have envisaged. Napoleon, on the other hand, was nothing if not practical and full of compromise. He took what he found ready to his hand, looked at it well, and turned it to the best advantage. and the result was something at once so supple and so strong, so exquisitely suited to its environment, that for 80 years it served France with scarce a change, and even today supports solidly all of France's recent superstructures. Out of this new world of civil servants and state officials, the first consul created, by the choice of the functionaries he appointed, and by the consideration with which he surrounded them, a new aristocracy of his own making. The service of the state was a task so great that it conferred a sort of nobility on the man who performed it adequately. To be useful to one's country was the one thing needful. Napoleon placed so high the importance of the civil servant that until 1880 or thereabouts the fonctionnaire of France retained the first rank, at any rate in provincial society. 50 years ago, and even 30 years ago, a prefect was a very considerable personage, and even greater than he was Monsieur le Premier Président, the chief magistrate of the local courts of justice. Below prefect and president came a number of other officials: collector of taxes, registrar, functionaries of the post office, the rivers and forests, the roads and bridges, the university, the clergy, for Napoleon made his peace with the Church, and that was perhaps the masterstroke of his magic wand. By the Concordat, or Convention of 1801, it was agreed between the first consul and the Pope that the civil power should name the bishops and archbishops, subject to the ordination of the Pope, and that these in their turn should appoint the curés and vicars, subject to the ratification of the state. No claim on the forfeited church lands was to disturb in their rights of possession the holders of biens nationaux. Thus peace was secured, and the peasants and the provincial bourgeoisie conciliated by the restoration of a beloved religion, which no longer threatened their tenure of its forfeited fields. Many an honest country lawyer, seated in his comfortable confiscated priory, listened with tears in his eyes to the first peal of those church bells that for the last 10 years had hung mute and useless in the belfry. This world of civil servants, magistrates, professors, priests, is all the more obedient to orders that it is constantly in movement. The turning wheel of fortune and of state affairs leaves them no time to root and take on too many local interests. And from one end of France to the other they will find, wheresoever they may be appointed, the same order, the same method, the same unity. There is of late in France a strong reaction against the centralization of Napoleon's system, but we may suppose it suited the country, since it has lasted so long. The French like to depend on the central power for their administration, and then to rail at that administration, which, though evidently imperfect, is, on the whole, I think, more efficient than that of any other country. The daily life of the nation still appears singularly well organized on Napoleon's bedrock. Judge what it must have seemed, following on the confusion of the Directory. Not since the last days of Henri IV had France enjoyed a period of such promise and prosperity. During the 4 years in which Bonaparte worked with Portalis, Tronchet, Cambacérès, and the other jurisconsults at the making of an unparalleled civil code, France was admirably governed, Vendée pacified, the Church conciliated, and everywhere Napoleon showed himself open to compromise, respectful of realities, willing to reckon with the force of a tradition. He knew how to make a sacrifice and accept a compensation, how to give and take, and out of shreds and patches he made an enduring fabric, as the Romans with their slender bricks built monuments that stand today. Meanwhile, victory followed victory abroad. The mismanagement of the Directory had lost, or at least endangered, all of Bonaparte's earlier conquests, but the first consul soon redeemed their blunders. His initial dash was to secure that left bank of the Rhine, which to the sons of the Revolution seemed the essential bulwark and natural frontier of France. Next he pounced on Milan, and acclaimed in Lombardy by shouts of joy, he reasserted the power of France across the Alps by a splendid victory at Marengo. The next battle was at Hohenlinden. These are immortal names. For the second time the Holy Roman Empire was obliged to recognize and sanction the pretensions of France and award her Alsace, Belgium, Savoy, and also to admit the existence of her affiliated republics in Lombardy, Switzerland, and Holland. Austria made peace at Lunéville in 1801, and England in 1802 signed the Peace of Amiens. France had made short work of her enemies. Victory, peace, success, order, prosperity bring a monarch many friends. But Napoleon had still irreconcilable foes. They were the same that Louis XVI had feared, the Jacobins, the émigrés. Nothing could reconcile the first to the final loss of liberty. They had curbed their necks for a moment in wartime to a yoke of their own choosing. They had, in Marat's phrase, opposed the despotism of freedom to the despotism of kings, but that had been a matter of military necessity, a temporary derogation, an interlude. The sovereign people had yielded none of its rights, which now were confiscated by one man, to all intents and purposes a monarch. Napoleon in their sight was as clearly an invading brigand chief as in the eyes of the stubbornest defenders of the altar and the throne. And the ultra-royalists, although they had seen their friends and kinsfolk driven in herds to the place of butchery and slaughtered there like animals, loathed the Corsican usurper even worse than Robespierre. In their eyes, might, though never so seemly, could never stand for right. Strange to think that these obscure royalist conspirators 100 years ago were fighting for the same principle, right not might, which the democracies of the world today defend in arms against the encroachments of the central empires. Bonaparte felt the danger of their fervent fanaticism. All round him, his friends compared his rule to those last years of Henri IV, which were the halcyon time of France. He could not but remember how the knife of Ravaillac had cut short that reign of prosperity. And he too was in constant danger. His own generals, jealous of his supremacy, conspired with his enemies in London. The West Country, only nominally pacified, was a hotbed of plots and murderous purposes. As for the Jacobins, their one religion was the state. In defence of their adored republic, the honestest of them would stick at nothing. On Christmas Eve, 1800, an attempt was made to blow up Bonaparte by the explosion of an infernal machine as he drove to the opera. There was an immense sensation in the theatre, women shedding tears, everyone cheering the First Consul. The windows of his wife's carriage were shattered. Her daughter's neck was cut by the fragments of glass. 9 persons were killed. 20 died of their injuries. Brave as he was, Napoleon was superstitious, and he was not an hereditary king, inured from his childhood to the risks of the métier de roi. This attempt made a deep impression on his sensibility. He thought it the work of fanatical republicans, and transported 130 Jacobins without a particle of evidence against them. Miserable man! He sent 2 of them to die on the island of St. Helena. But Fouché, his chief of police, himself an ex-Jacobin, assured the First Consul that the real culprits were the émigrés, who in foreign countries devised at their ease the plots they found means to execute in Paris. At the bare idea, Napoleon lost his sang-froid. "Am I a dog," he would say, "to be shot down in the street? And are my murderers a sort of sacred animals?" This nervous rage must be his excuse. But no, there can be no excuse for the assassination of the Duke of Enghien. It was in 1804 that a fresh conspiracy, vaster and still more formidable, was framed among the enemies of Bonaparte. 2 of his generals, Pichegru, the conqueror of Holland, Moreau, who gained the victory of Hohenlinden, and a Breton yeoman, Georges Cadoudal, the very soul of the royalist rising in the West, with 300 royalist gentlemen, were affiliated to the plot. Their scheme was to make a dash at Napoleon sword in hand, kidnap him one evening on the road to Malmaison, his country house, or assail him in the midst of his consular guards during some ceremony on the Esplanade des Invalides. Revolt rather than murder were their object, and what they chiefly desired was to give the tyrant a taste of English hospitality. War had broken out afresh with England. Still, their swords were not for show, and they were prepared to kill him if he resisted. The police were informed in time. One of Georges Cadoudal's friends sold him for 100,000 crowns. The consul was all aflame with a passion of wrath and a feverish lust for revenge. It was rumoured that one of the younger Bourbon princes was as deep in the affair as Pichegru or Georges. The real culprit seems to have been the Duke of Berry. But Napoleon's suspicions fell on the Duke of Enghien, one of the youngest and most lovable of the Bourbons, at that time living in retirement in the Duchy of Baden, in the society of a woman with whom he was devotedly in love. Bonaparte had no more evidence of this young man's complicity than he had required 4 years before, when he exiled the Jacobins. He acted on a Corsican impulse. Pichegru had been arrested in February, Georges on the 9th of March. On the 15th, the young Duke of Enghien was captured in his own house, a few leagues on the further side of the Rhine, was hurried in secrecy through France by the picket of dragoons who had carried him off, spirited to the castle of Vincennes just outside Paris, tried there in the dead of night by a hastily assembled court-martial, and shot in a fosse of the fortifications at 2 o'clock in the morning. This lawless, reckless crime, which violated the territory of a peaceful neighbour and outraged all the codes and conventions of international law, never ceased to haunt Napoleon, and more than any other action of his life discredited him in the eyes of Europe. He who loved order and discipline and regularity, he who had organized his country, he who loathed the misrule and anarchy of the Revolution, had shown himself in this mad vengeance, this unwarranted vendetta, as utterly estranged from the spirit of law as a Marat or a Danton. In later years, I think he would have given several of his victories to recall it. He mentions it in his testament, not without remorse. He excuses himself by saying that the Count of Artois maintained 60 paid assassins at his orders in the French capital. In his latter days he laid the blame on Talleyrand, and invoked the excuse of the tyrant who sacrificed Thomas à Becket. Why did my servant give me no chance of recalling the impulse of my wrath? End of section 35. Section 36 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 3, Napoleon, Part 2. It was a last echo of Danton's terrible policy, faire peur aux royalistes, a warning that in his dealings with them, the present master of France would exact an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and perhaps even an eye for a tooth. But if in Europe the rumour of this brutal murder provoked a thrill of horror, in France it served his turn. To the mass of the French public, the innocent young Duke, kidnapped from his German home, was as surely a conspirator and a would-be assassin as Pichegru or Cadoudal. Had he not paid the penalty of his crimes? His affair was, as the French say, chose jugée, and his memory a thing to abhor. The general adoration for Bonaparte was still increased by the danger from which he had so narrowly escaped, and the lesson to be drawn from the whole affair appeared the need of protecting him by every means. Now the obvious way of defending a sovereign against assassination is to make his throne hereditary. There is far less inducement to remove a king who leaves an heir behind him. So just a week after the shooting of the hapless Enghien, the Senate sent a solemn message to Bonaparte, adjuring him to assume a hereditary crown, to take the style and title of Napoleon, Emperor. The country, consulted as before by a plebiscite, responded by a vote in which 3,500,000 ayes took all the sting from a bare 5,000 noes. Meanwhile, Cadudal was executed, and Pichegru was found strangled in his prison. "The happiest moment of my life," the Emperor said one day in his exile, "was perhaps after my victories in Italy. What enthusiasm! What cries of 'Long live the liberator of Italy!' And all at 25. From that time I saw what I might become. I already saw the world beneath me, as if I were being carried through the air." He must indeed have felt the world beneath him on that 18th of May, 1804, when he stood in Notre Dame, crowned with laurel, as we see him in David's great picture, his generals all round him, a mass of gold and frothing feathers, his wife kneeling at his feet, her heavy jewelled train held by attendant princesses. Behind him, on the steps of the altar, the Pope of Rome, come so far to consecrate the Lord's anointed. But as Pope Pius lifted from the altar the very crown of Charlemagne, Napoleon suddenly reached out his arm, seized the symbol of sovereignty, and with his own hand, unaided, settled it firmly on his brows. "I found the crown of France in the gutter," he said one day later, "and I picked it up on the point of my sword." The Emperor soon found himself at war with half the world. The Peace of Amiens had but lasted a twelvemonth, and Napoleon was again fighting England tooth and nail. By a characteristic act of his arbitrary authority, he detained as prisoners of war all the English travelling or residing in France at the moment when war was declared anew. His wrath against England flamed fiery than ever since his discovery of the Royalist plot, for in his eyes perfidious Albion was not only a rival and enemy, but the harbourer of all conspirators, the refuge of the Count of Artois, the chartered meeting-place of assassins. But he would soon reduce those proud islanders to nothingness. During the summer of 1804 he concentrated his extraordinary intelligence on an immense project, that of the utter destruction of his enemy, and he spent 5 weeks on the north coast in front of Dover. Why did he not succeed? Is there a power that protects the brave against a tyrant? Napoleon seems to have forgotten nothing. His army was ready. His navy, by a brilliant series of feints, was to decoy our ships to defend the coasts of Egypt and of India. Give me 3 days undisturbed in the Dover Straits, and with God's help I'll make an end of England. Those 3 days, happily, he was not to have. In vain he stands on the shores of Boulogne, mapping out his future conquests and muttering to himself, "Je ferai une telle peur aux Anglais." In vain his ships set out for the East in the most convincing order. No visible arm from heaven intervened. Did a clerk in the French War Office, copying out the orders for the French fleet — he must have been a functionary of some rank — betray the Emperor's secret, as it has been supposed? John Bull remains unmoved, cruises calmly in the Channel, lets them dash unopposed towards Calcutta and Alexandria. After one bare week of emotion, London is cool as a cucumber. Admiral Cornwallis continues to blockade the best French ships in Brest harbour, and there they remain, bottled up, as our modern phrase goes, while Nelson keeps an imperturbable eye on Toulon. In vain, swift as swallows, the French ships skimmed past the coasts of Ireland to Egypt, to the West Indies. John Bull never turned a hair, smoked his pipe on his safe cliffs, and never thought of changing his plans. There were no Zeppelins in those days. And with the English boats in the Channel, no fear. Despite the concentration of Frenchmen and flat-bottomed boats on the sands across the ditch, no fear lest the fuming Emperor should slip across some dark night and invite himself to breakfast. It is true that one fine day the Corsican was to taste of English hospitality on an island, but not on ours. Napoleon in his best years was never obstinate. When he saw that one of his plans was doomed to failure, he immediately substituted another. As he himself explained to Las Casas in the memorial in his own remarkable words, "I was never bent on forcing circumstances to fit into my conceptions. As a rule, I let myself be led by the course of events. Who beforehand can say what unsuspected accident may change the shape of things? How often I have had to alter the very essence of a plan. Indeed, I nearly always acted on a general view of things, rather than in accordance with a settled project." End of section 36. Section 37 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 3, Napoleon, Part 3. Therefore Napoleon abandoned the intended invasion of England, and indeed in after days was prone to say that he had never seriously meant it, and turned his mind to conquest of the continental powers. He had soon provoked Austrians, Russians, Prussians to a half unwilling quarrel. The two emperors, Austria, Russia, took the field. The latter, a young man, Alexander, believed in his innocence that he could beat Napoleon, and his first experience was Austerlitz. The battle began on the anniversary of Bonaparte's coronation, the 2nd of December, 1805, early in the morning. An hour after midday, Napoleon was master of Europe. A few days later, the Austrian Francis II signed the Peace of Pressburg. He renounced the proud title of Emperor of Germany. There no longer existed a Holy Roman Empire. That age-long enemy of France simply disappeared. But Napoleon permitted his vanquished foe to adopt the humbler style of Emperor of Austria as he signed away Venice, Istria, Dalmatia, Tyrol, and many lands in southern Germany. And in place of the historic empire, the natural enemy of France, Napoleon created a new league of the German states which he called the Confederation of the Rhine, no terrible foe, but in Mr. Fisher's excellent phrase, a mosaic of weak and warring governments. For what Napoleon feared above all things was the unity of Germany. Then the King of Prussia declared war on France. His two armies were annihilated in 9 days at Jena, as Auerstadt followed Austerlitz, and Napoleon marched into Berlin. There he learns that the Russians are coming to the aid of their allies, rushes toward them, beats them 5 times running on the banks of the Vistula, and hunts them into Poland. At Eylau they attempt to resist, but at Friedland the Russian general allows himself to be caught as in a trap. And the French victory was so complete that Alexander believed his defeat irretrievable and consented to the conqueror's terms of peace. At Tilsit, at the first contact with his enemy, the enthusiastic Alexander became his adoring friend. By this campaign, Prussia was hopelessly mutilated, exhausted, and burdened with a French army of occupation. Russia had to recognize these changes and to accept a new kingdom of Westphalia, with Napoleon's brother Jerome for its king. What is more, the Russian emperor had to consent to an alliance with the new Charlemagne. Napoleon was in the finest spirits. He liked the alliance. He liked the Tsar, a very handsome, good young emperor, with more mind than he is generally credited with. He liked being able to patronize handsome emperors, beautiful propitiatory queens like Louisa of Prussia, and his old enemy, the ex-emperor of Germany. He loved to dominate. And again he turned his thoughts to our unconquered island, more hated than ever now, since at Trafalgar, in 1805, Nelson had destroyed the French fleet. So, master of Europe in 1807, Napoleon parries the thrust by decreeing the continental blockade. That is to say, All European ports were to be closed to English trade. They should neither buy nor sell nor have any traffic with us. England was excommunicated. And then irrepressible Austria, always defeated, never irremediably vanquished, Austria, influenced by England, again declared war. Napoleon, who just then was occupied in Spain, in a blaze of anger rushed across the Pyrenees, darted his lightnings on Austria, conquered again at Wagram, and imposed peace at Vienna in 1809. Rivoli in 1796, Marengo in 1800, Austerlitz in 1805, Wagram in 1809. How many more crushing defeats would Austria require before Napoleon could be sure of her submission? Did some accident set him to thinking of the old distich, how Austria made her way in the world not by fighting but by marrying? Tu felix Austria nube. Did the constant revolts of the untamed empire make him devise a new manner of bond and curb? Did the difficulties of establishing a succession for the throne of France suggest the wisdom of an imperial alliance? Josephine was 6 years older than her husband. She could no longer expect to give him an heir. He had loved her with an ardent, sensual, jealous passion. She was the only woman he had loved, so he averred on St. Helena. But it was clear that she could not give a prince to the empire. Reasons of state prevailed, like Titus, demissit invitus invitam. A divorce was pronounced between the French emperor and his wife. In 1810 he married the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, Maria Louisa. In 1811 a son was born to them, the King of Rome. Napoleon had now entered the family of monarchs. The little Corsican lieutenant had become the nephew by marriage of Marie Antoinette. So lofty, so rapid an ascension may well disturb a conqueror's moral balance. If I had been placed so high, said the Russian emperor, as he gazed on Napoleon's statue dominating the column of the Place Vendôme, if I had been placed so high, my head too would have been dizzy. Lord Rosebery is right in supposing that supreme power destroyed the equilibrium of Napoleon's mind. After Wagram, after the Austrian alliance, it is easy to see now that the conqueror should have lain low, should have consolidated his magnificent position, and not have sought to extend it. It was difficult for the Society of Sovereigns to admit into their circle this victorious usurper who had humiliated them all. Yet if Bonaparte had shown himself the Bonaparte of 1799, the scholarly, quiet, unassuming Bonaparte, who had disarmed suspicion before displaying his full power, it is probable that Europe would have swallowed that difficult doctrine of the natural limits, would have accorded France the left bank of the Rhine and the frontiers of the Empire of Gaul. But now that Napoleon thought himself sure of the non-opposition and even of the support of Austria, he became more than ever overweening and extravagant in his pretensions. The expansion of France threatened the breathing space of Europe. Charlemagne of old had had one only brother with whom to divide the spoils of empire. Napoleon had a whole ravenous family to find in thrones and crowns. France, Naples, Westphalia, Holland did not exhaust his requirements. Lucien, Pauline, Caroline, Elisa were still without a sceptre. The Napoleon who declared that all the countries of Europe should keep their archives in Paris, that the French Empire should become the mother country of all sovereignties, that all the kings of the earth should have palaces of residence in Paris and attend in state the coronations of the French emperors, had obviously lost the balance of his reason. He had ceased to calculate coolly and to see any bounds, moral, physical, or international, to any freak of ambition which might occur to him. At this period of his career, did Napoleon lose his grasp of reality? Was he really mad? His ministers thought so. His wild dreams of universal conquest filled them with mortal apprehension. the feelings of Talleyrand and Fouché may be likened to those of a traveller driven by a lunatic chauffeur along some mountain road that skirts a precipice. And not only themselves, but the future of France was imperilled. All the great functionaries who approached the Emperor at that moment appear to have shared their dire misgiving. "Voulez-vous que je vous dise la vérité?" said De Cretz, the Minister of Marine, to Marshal Marmont, Duke of Ragusa, in 1810. "Voulez-vous que je vous dise la vérité? L'Empereur est fou, tout à fait fou. Il nous culbutera tant que nous sommes." And Bernadotte, his old comrade in arms, just adopted by the King of Sweden for his heir, did not scruple to call his Emperor of yesterday un fou dangereux, a dangerous lunatic. Narbonne, his general, his minister, the man whom Napoleon loved, exclaimed in 1812, "Where is the keeper of this man of genius?" "He's a madman," said Fouché. "C'est un insensé. Il faut en finir." Was he mad, or was he merely, as Talleyrand said, uncivilized? At any rate, his vast dreams, his disregard of the possible, his violence, his impulsiveness, his egotism, fostered in those whom he offended a belief in the derangement of his mind. Of Volney, whom he kicked in the stomach for saying that France wanted the Bourbons, and who was carried unconscious from his presence, or Berthier, whom he is said to have attacked with tongs, or that Chief Justice whom he belaboured with his fists, may be excused for having their doubts as to his sanity. Too often his servants and his ministers pleaded lunacy in their sovereign to attenuate the vileness of their treacherous intrigues. Yet in the treachery of a Fouché or a Talleyrand, love of country played its part. These ministers had undergone the strenuous training of the Jacobins in all their avatars, whether terrorists, republicans, pillars of the Empire or the Restoration. They were at heart the men of '93. They had one religion, their country, and one only virtue, patriotism. Despite their lack of honour, fidelity, morality, or truth, they had one ideal which constantly they served, the ultimate advantage of France. And it was not to the advantage of France in their thinking that Napoleon should whirl her without cease along the mad career of a second Attila. From the day when the Emperor began to cast his eyes with envy on Turkey and India, a secret discord divided him from the heads of his administration, for Talleyrand and Fouché were disciples of Danton. They conceived France as a modern Gaul. So much, no more. Certainly not a universal monarchia. Le Rhin, les Alpes, les Pyrénées, said Talleyrand, sont la conquête nationale. Le reste est la conquête de l'empereur. La France n'y tient pas. And the ministers of a dangerous madman, as they thought, began to hold private confabulations with his enemies. In 1809 they did all they could to undermine by secret intrigue the policy of their sovereign. Traitors to Napoleon, not to France. When in 1808 Napoleon went to Erfurt to discuss with Alexander the proposed conquest of Constantinople, Talleyrand lay in wait for the Tsar and accosted him. "Sire, what are you doing here? Your part is to save Europe, and you can only save Europe by resisting Napoleon. The French nation is civilized. Its sovereign is not civilized. The Emperor of Russia is civilized, not so the Russian people. Let the Emperor of Russia be the ally of the people of France." The subtle, sentimental, vacillating Alexander was taken with this argument. Indeed, already the fascinating prestige of Napoleon, which had aroused his enthusiasm at Tilsit, was wearing thin. He perceived that the lion's ally must always accept the second place. Russia was sacrificed to the exigencies of the continental blockade. The trade of Russia demanded intercourse with England, which the French Emperor forbade. End of section 37. Section 38 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 3, Napoleon, Part 4. Talleyrand had time to indoctrinate an apt pupil before he met with a richly earned disgrace. In 1809, Napoleon's mother, shrewd and suspicious as are the unlearned women of the South, surprised the secret intrigue of Talleyrand and Fouché, their carefully hidden colloquies, in a friend's country house at Suresnes, and she herself heard Fouché say that phrase we have quoted, "C'est un insensé, il faut en finir." She warned her son. In 6 days Napoleon came posting back from Spain, dashed across France to Paris, sent Talleyrand to the right-about, depriving him of his charge of Grand Chamberlain. He kept Fouché indispensable as head of the police, but he kept him under watch and ward. This was in 1810. The times were troubled. Napoleon seemed possessed by a feverish, reckless desire to strain his fortunes to the utmost. The sovereigns of Europe found him an impossible neighbour. We have seen how in 1804 he carried off the Duke of Enghien, shot him, violating the territory of the Duke of Baden, with whom he was on terms of peace. In 1805 he abducted the English minister at Hamburg and carried him off to Paris, him and his papers. This was no matter of a mere Rhenish margrave and a French émigré. It concerned the plenipotentiary of a great power living under the protection of the German emperor. In 1809 he seized upon the Pope, swooped down upon the Holy Father in his quiet Quirinal, drove him away under military escort to a prison, first at Grenoble, then at Savona, finally in 1811 at Fontainebleau. But of all his abductions, his sequestrations, none was so extraordinary as his retention in 1808 of the whole royal family of Spain. Here Napoleon shows himself completely the brigand chief. His prisoners were not interesting. Never had the peninsula sunk so low in point of prosperity, power, or influence as under the rule of Charles IV. The Bourbon king and queen were like an odious caricature of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He, kind and loyal, but almost imbecile, incapable of any activity of body or mind, and hypnotized by his blind devotion to his wife. She, arrogant, energetic, dissolute, with only one thought in her head, the advancement and good pleasure of her minister and favourite, the handsome parvenu Godoy, whom she had created Prince of Peace. Godoy was the tyrant of Spain, hated by the nation. The king's eldest son, Ferdinand, Prince of the Asturias, rose in arms against the monstrous regimen of his mother and Godoy. The old king, bewildered, abdicated one day, recalled his abdication the next, and watched his kingdom drift into civil war. Then Napoleon invited the king, the queen, the Prince of the Asturias, and the Prince of Peace, who had all appealed to his decision, to meet him on the frontiers of France and Spain. His mastermind would cut the Gordian knot of a family quarrel. Too angry with each other to suspect this benevolent foreigner, the king, the queen, the two princes, all talking at once and very excited, arrived at the rendezvous. Napoleon gave them the wisest, the kindest advice, pacified the two rival kings, induced Prince Ferdinand to abdicate in favour of his father, persuaded King Charles in his turn to abdicate in favour of Napoleon, and finally himself passed on the crown to his elder brother Joseph Bonaparte, King of Naples, whose throne, which this preferment left empty, would come in handy for Murat, who had married Caroline Bonaparte. When the despoiled, bewildered Bourbons would fain have turned their faces home, they found the frontiers closed. Princely pleasure houses, ample incomes had been provided for them all in France, but there they must remain, while in their stead Joseph Bonaparte should cross the Pyrenees. Fontainebleau, Chambord, Valençay, Compiègne were set at their disposal. But they were captives, Prince of Peace and all. In vain they protested. Spain rose in victorious insurrection. All her factions at once fused to an indignant unity at this insult to her national honour. In vain Europe lifted hands of horror, and England sent an expeditionary force to Portugal and Spain under a new young general, Wellington. Napoleon was not disturbed. For some time he had been anxious about his western frontier. The empire appeared lopsided in its immense development. Its eastern extent was now prodigious. Hamburg was the chef-lieu of the French department of the Elbe, Rome the capital of the department of the Tiber, but in the southwest the Pyrenean boundary was but a few days' march from Paris. It was a relief to behold Spain at last practically absorbed into the empire. Napoleon wrote to his brother, "Spain is quite another thing, much better than Naples. It is a kingdom of 11 million inhabitants and 150 millions of revenue, which places you at 3 days' journey from Paris and covers entirely one of our frontiers." Napoleon was satisfied, and yet that long, that harassing peninsular war of independence was really the beginning of the end. But he was much occupied in the north. The alliance with Russia had not proved durable. The blockade, which was intended to starve and ruin England, had incidentally stifled Russian trade. That choice of an Austrian princess had humiliated the enthusiastic Alexander, who had intended one of his own sisters to wear the French imperial crown. And also Napoleon would not listen to the Muscovite dream of Constantinople and the Dardanelles. He meant himself to be Emperor of the East. War broke out between the two allies in 1812. Here too, as in Spain, Napoleon made the mistake of underrating his adversary. The constancy and courage of the Spaniards in repelling a usurper had surprised the great man, who esteemed them according to the supine indifference and shiftless idleness with which they had supported the yoke of the Spanish Bourbons. Neither could he guess that these inconsistent Russians, the children of Europe, lovable and puerile, would show themselves capable of burning their capital and devastating their provinces in defence of their country. Napoleon, like all the great men born of the Revolution, could understand no patriotism but his own, with the result that this heir of the ideas of '89 will succumb to a series of popular and national movements subversive of that Roman peace, that implacable empire which he sought to impose on all the races of Europe. The French public was not informed of these new Russian hostilities until some 10 days after they had commenced. The nation received the tidings with a calm that masked something of the sullenness of despair. The wars had gone on for 11 years, and there was still no end in sight. "My men would fight for ever," said the Emperor, "if they were not so fond of their families." Frenchmen are very fond of their families, of their fields and farms, their towns. They like, too, to turn an honest penny, to lay it by, to spend it wisely in some solid acquisition, to work like artists at their trades, and to live sociably in a friendly society. This ancient life of France was impossible during the long duration of the First Empire. In March 1812, Napoleon held his court in Dresden. It was perhaps the proudest moment of his life. He stayed there all the spring and early summer. The Emperor of Austria, the King of Prussia, all the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine formed his following. Saxony, Westphalia came and bowed down before him. Bavaria was his washpot, and over Württemberg he cast his shoe. Every sovereign in Europe, except the Sultan, the Russian Emperor, and the King of England, was at his feet. "It was the greatest moment of my life," he said on St. Helena. On the 22nd of June he declared war on Russia. He was in too great a hurry. He had learned at Dresden that he would have the support neither of Sweden nor of Turkey. He would have no allies in the north or on the east. "I was too hasty," he owned. I should have stayed a year on the Niemen, and first of all have made a meal of Prussia. Instead of that, he pursued his old victorious plan, a dash, a pounce, a knock-down blow, and he seats himself in the capital of the conquered enemy, slashes with his sword a slice or two from the fattest part of their territory, imposes himself as suzerain inclined to a Pax Romana. All went at first according to promise. Napoleon crossed the Niemen, gained a victory at Smolensk, another on the Moskova, and entered Moscow in September. But there, instead of dictating terms and imposing conditions, he found a novel state of things. The Russians, as we know, burned their ancient capital. He encountered emptiness, void, desolation. He was there like a man boxing with a moving shadow. The very strength that he put out ensured his fall. It is difficult to understand why Napoleon should have lingered among the charred and blackened ruins of Moscow until after the middle of October. Probably he hoped that Alexander would capitulate. Our emperor thought the war was over, wrote Ségur. Day by day he expected an answer from Petersburg. He nourished his hopes on his recollections of Tilsit and Erfurt. Was it likely he should have less influence over Alexander at Moscow? And like all men who have long been lucky, he expected his desires to come true. But the master of the empty house still gave no sign of life. And the climate surprised the conqueror by its mildness. In his bulletin of the 14th of October he writes, "Le temps est encore beau," and even on the 27th, "Le temps est superbe, les chemins sont beaux, c'est le reste de l'automne." The Corsican could not dream how sudden, how fatal might be the change of the equinox, while the old Russian Kutuzov smiled and said, "We have an ally worth all of Bonaparte's. His name is General Winter." And Napoleon continues his letter. "C'est le soleil et les belles journées de Fontainebleau. L'armée est dans un pays extrêmement riche qui peut se comparer au meilleur de la France." On the 7th of November there came a sudden frost, and on the 16th the thermometer marked 18 degrees centigrade below freezing point. The roads were covered with a slippery glaze of ice. The French and German horses of the cavalry, the artillery, the transport, perished by thousands every night. 30,000 of them in a few days. I am quoting Napoleon's bulletin. With the terrible result that the cannons, the wagons of munitions, all the commissariat stocks and stores, the provisions that accompany an army of 600,000 men, could no longer take the road and had to be destroyed, for the most part, in the midst of the wintry plains of Russia. That army, so fortunate and prosperous on the 6th of November, was 10 days later shorn of its cavalry, its artillery, its transport service, alike incapable of giving battle or of getting food. Between it and that frontier of the Niemen which they had passed so joyously in June stretched 50 days of dreary marching in unimaginable snow and slippery ice, while the Cossacks viciously harried them on all sides. When the pursuit ended on the western frontier, more than 300,000 men of the Grand Army had disappeared. The dispatch which brought this terrible news to Paris on the 18th of December 1812 concluded with these words intended to reassure and to console: "His Majesty's health has never been better." It seemed heartless, but Napoleon knew his Paris. He must be alive and present. The Parisians only 2 days later learned that the Emperor was in their midst. He knew that the magic of his presence alone could comfort and inspire his people in this calamity. He had heard in Russia of the unpopularity of the war, even when that war presented no reverses, and recently he had learned how toward the close of October General de Mallet had spread a false report of the Emperor's death and had attempted to accomplish a royalist coup d'état. The thing had failed, Mallet had been shot, and here was the Emperor, bringing bad news, it is true, but full of prestige and resource. Universal as was the desire for peace, Napoleon had but to appear in order to carry the day. In the course of 4 months he raised an army of 226,000 men and 457 guns, and hurried at their head to Germany, where Prussia had already joined his enemies, where a new disaster might lose him the support of the Confederation of the Rhine, where Austria herself seemed but a dubious friend. Toute l'Europe marchait avec nous il y a un an. Toute l'Europe marche aujourd'hui contre nous, wrote Napoleon in a dispatch of this campaign, and he added that Europe always follows the lead of either France or England. But he did not despair of defeating his arch-enemy, though still the seat of war continued to contract, though the immense limits of the empire began to shrink and shrivel. The battle was at Moscow in 1812, at Dresden, at Leipzig in 1813. In 1814, the enemy was ravaging the fields of France. All the world was now in truth against Napoleon. At Leipzig, the Saxons and the Württembergers had ratted and joined the enemy in the middle of the fight. The Bavarians, who yesterday had fought in Napoleon's cohorts, attempted to stop his retreat and to bar the passage of the Rhine. France was invaded north, south, and east by more than 700,000 men, eager to avenge the defeats and disasters which all the nations of Europe save England had suffered at her hands. From Frankfurt in November 1813, the Allies sent an envoy to Paris, offering to treat if Napoleon would accept as a basis the natural frontiers of France: the Rhine, the Alps, the Mediterranean, and the Pyrenees. This was all the Revolution had ever claimed. This was all that in his youth he had gone out to win. The rest was over and above. But Napoleon could not dispense with that magnificent superfluity. He refused, and the nations pressed round him again in battle. Again his empire dwindled and tottered. Again they offered terms. This time the limits were narrower. He must renounce Belgium and Savoy. But even so, the France he could have kept was the old glorious France of the monarchy. Napoleon must have lost the balance of his reason when he refused to make peace. At last began that campaign of France which was as brilliant, as marvellous, as heroic, but not as successful as his first campaign in Italy. Wherever he fought, he triumphed, but wherever he was not, his generals were beaten. The army, in truth, was exhausted, worn out, and moreover, Napoleon, in the 15 years of his fighting them, had taught his art to his enemies. The emperor himself was no longer what he had been. The very thin man had become a very fat one. His mental energy, still capable of lightning flashes and surprising darts, would sink sometimes into a sort of lethargy, a morbid and feverish activity alternating with a strange listlessness. He had become garrulous and discursive. In fact, his youth was past. He had said at Austerlitz to one of his generals, "One has but a short time for war. I am good for another 6 years, and then I shall have to stop." He had spun the 6 years out to 8, but now he had to stop. As the armies of Europe marched on Paris, Napoleon decided to fight his last battle under the walls of the capital. But before he could bring up his forces, Paris had capitulated to the Tsar. In Paris, Alexander met his old friend Talleyrand, while Napoleon at Fontainebleau was sending a message of surrender to the Allies. The minister he had disgraced was negotiating the future of France with the sovereigns of Europe. In his hotel of the Rue Saint-Florentin, he treated with the enemy as great power with great power, recommending the return of the Bourbons to the exclusion of Napoleon and all the persons of his family. The ex-emperor had hoped for a regency and the eventual succession of his infant son. But as marshal after marshal forsook the hopeless cause, that last hope had to be abandoned. The little king of Rome dethroned, proclaimed merely Prince of Parma and Duke of Reichstadt, was to receive his education at the court of his grandfather, as became an Austrian prince. Maria Louisa was to return with her little boy to Vienna. Napoleon himself was to receive the Empire of Elba, a small island off the coast of Tuscany between Ligourne and Corsica. One after another the Bonapartes vanished from the scenes of affairs, richly pensioned off in their golden obscurity. On the 4th of April, Napoleon's marshals, Ney, Oudinot, Lefebvre, Macdonald, forced him to accept these terms of peace. On the 6th he signed the act of abdication, and the Senate proclaimed the reign of Louis XVIII. In his despair, Napoleon attempted to poison himself. At least that old legend, once discredited, is again accepted by recent historians, and surely some warrant is given to it by a phrase in the Adieux of Fontainebleau, and also in that line of the act of abdication where the ex-emperor declares himself prêt à quitter la France et même la vie pour le bien de la patrie. But Napoleon had not yet run his course. A wonderful, a miraculous adventure was still in front of him. Life seemed over, but the future had its secret to impart. Meanwhile, after a long spell of dreary waiting in his dull, deserted palace, on the 20th of April at Fontainebleau, he bade farewell to his soldiers of the old guard. All was not lost while you fought by my side, but the war would have gone on for ever, would have degenerated into a civil war, and France would have lost her prosperity. I have sacrificed my interests to those of the country. I am going away. And you, my friends, will go on serving France. The happiness of France is all I think of, the one desire of my heart. Do not pity me. If I have consented to survive, it is to serve your fame. I mean to chronicle the great exploits we have achieved together. Adieu. Farewell, my children, my comrades, farewell, forget me not. And so Napoleon set out for Elba, an island some 200 kilometers square, containing 2 little towns and 7 villages. The modern Charlemagne was emperor of this principality en toute souveraineté, and the Treaty of Fontainebleau guaranteed him an income of 2 millions of francs, 80,000 pounds, never paid. He has wished us adieu. We may wish him au revoir. End of section 38. Section 39 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 4, The Return of the Bourbons. 8 days after the departure of Napoleon for his microscopic empire of Elba, the Count of Artois entered France at Nancy as Lieutenant General of the kingdom. The first of the royal princes to leave France, he was also the first to return. Though something of a fool, and not over fond of risking his skin, Artois was every inch a royal figure, handsome, elegant, generous. He was at once very religious and essentially frivolous, devout, noble, courteous. There was enough of the knight about him to please the taste of a romantic age, and we are just coming to the romantics. But fate was unkind to Artois in bringing him into power. He was cast by nature for the part of a pretender, and had not learned how to play the king. Chateaubriand dubbed him the Christian knight, and added, "He has aged a good deal since I sketched him thus, but there is still a likeness." Poetic stories were rife concerning him, how, for instance, on the death of Madame de Polastron he had sworn never to love another woman, and had kept his word, mere Lothario as he had been until then. He was as full of prejudices and obstinacies and ignorances as a charming, narrow-minded prince may be on the shady side of 50. His brother was a very different person. The staunchest royalists quailed a little when they thought of Louis XVIII entering critical and half disaffected Paris as the successor of Napoleon. Artois had been first and foremost in all the royalist intrigues, but at least you knew where you had him. There was something selfish and neutral about the sceptical Louis, generally inclined, like his brother Louis says, to think that in every question there was a great deal to be said on both sides. Naturally liberal, The circumstances of his life in exile, hunted from refuge to refuge as the advance of Napoleon dislodged him from Poland, from Prussia, from Italy, and the haunting memory of his murdered kinsfolk, had fostered in him incoherent rancours and sudden transitory rages little less violent than his brother's convictions. Such explosions were rare. All these chances and changes had developed in Louis XVIII a certain moral indifference, a detachment from men and things, an absence of belief in anything, a disenchanted misanthropy natural under the circumstances in a prince whose experience had been so cruel and whose nature was shrewd, wise, delicate, intelligent, but bitter and small. A quoter of Horace, a lover of letters, perhaps an author under the rose, this fastidious, gouty, and indolent valetudinarian saw himself promoted to the stormiest throne in Europe. Louis XVIII accumulated in his person all sorts of reasons why Paris should dislike him. Some of the citizens could remember how Monsieur had solemnly sworn never to leave the kingdom in February 1791, and had successfully decamped in June. The soldiers knew that he had fought with the Prussians at Valmy. He had more physical courage than his brother, when the first victory of the Republic had put him and his émigré to the rout. And for years now he had lived in England, returning in the unpopular character of a country squire from Buckinghamshire, a gouty old Anglais of 60, impotent, enormous in bulk, his helpless legs wrapped to the knees in wadded gaiters. Ignorant of the recent growth of France, he was, however, dignified and liberal in mind. He had not lived so many years in England for nothing. His first act was to grant a charter, that is to say, a political constitution which established in France the parliamentary system, ensured the liberty of public worship, while declaring the Catholic Church the religion of the state, professed all men equal before the law and the tax collector, admitted in a certain degree the liberty of the press, confirmed the existence of Napoleon's new nobility, recognized all the debts of the state, whatever their origin, and guaranteed the holders of confiscated estates in the possession of their lands by whomsoever forfeited. It was a charter informed with the spirit of '89. But the king returned to France surrounded by a world of émigrés who would die rather than countenance that spirit. Far more than the king, and even more than Artois, they had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. What were the feelings of the French when the Allies with their triumphant armies escorted the Bourbons to Paris? The prospect of peace, so long desired in vain, made at the first blush any change appear acceptable. 20 years of constant battle had exhausted the nation, and the last 2 wars, Russia, Spain, had brought home to the people the terrible conviction that under Napoleon peace would never be attained, since he would fight for the pleasure of it, for mere conquest and magnificence, in spite of the despair of his subjects. Doubtless the first movement at the fall of Bonaparte was not unlike that which saluted the fall of Robespierre. There were those who, like Necker's daughter, Madame de Staël, said openly that the defeat of Bonaparte meant the happiness of France. But when the people of Paris saw the conquering armies, those armies they had been used to vanquish, marching proudly through their streets, there came a sudden revulsion of feeling. Listen to the same Madame de Staël. When I saw Paris occupied by their foreign armies, ignorant of our language, our history, our great men, and the Tartar sentries pacing in front of the Tuileries and the Louvre, I felt a pang beyond endurance. Chateaubriand, another enemy of Bonaparte, who, like Germaine Necker, had returned to Paris in the train of the Allies, shall be our next witness. I own, he says, that I dreaded the first impression produced by the king. The impotent old gentleman from Buckinghamshire was so strange an equivalent for the terrible, adored, and dreaded emperor. Yet above those swollen feet, those legs muffled in their ludicrous gaiters à l'antique, above that huge belly, that unwieldy frame, there was a firm, pink face, not unhandsome, rather noble, an eye witty and wise, an expression of unruffled majesty. Louis XVIII. Had no doubts as to his rights or his reception. He was merely the first monarch in Europe returning home. And this is what Chateaubriand saw at his entry on the 3rd of May, 1814, when the king went to Notre Dame. To spare the sovereign the spectacle of a foreign army occupying his capital, the streets were lined with the soldiers of Napoleon's old guard, and they contemplated the man who had vanquished their emperor. I think I have never seen on any human visage an expression so threatening, so terrible, as I saw on all of theirs. These grenadiers, the conquerors of Europe, covered with wounds, deprived of their leader and forced to salute an old king, invalided not by his victories but by his years, under compulsion of the Russians, Austrians, Prussians, who occupied Napoleon's invaded capital, some of them frowning under their huge fur busbies till they masked their eyes, affected not to see their sovereign. Others drew down the corners of their mouth in the bitterest grimace of contempt and rage. And there were some who snarled like tigers, their teeth gleaming through their fierce moustaches. When the time came to present arms, their aspect was such as to make the mere spectator tremble. It was a strange Paris. White scarves and ribbons fluttered everywhere. In the streets the quaintly shabby figure of the émigré, hastening home from all the corners of Europe, greeted each other with a courtliness of phrase and a grace of gesture unknown to the magnificent barbarity of the Empire. The streets were full of Cossacks, Pomeranian grenadiers, and diplomatists from every court. There were as many sovereigns in Paris as during the palmy days of the Empire, but though Louis XVIII. Slept in the bed of Bonaparte, the real king of Paris was Alexander. The two monarchs were on less enthusiastic terms than France and Russia had been at Tilsit and at Erfurt. The haughty calm of Louis displeased the young autocrat who had brought him back from exile. Thrones fall, republics are reversed, emperors banished, kings come to their own again. The surface of French history appears a sequence of whirlpools, and yet life continues, and France has to be administered, and in fact is administered, with a continuity of order which at first sight appears miraculous. Behind the facade of sovereignty, which so often tumbles down and has hastily to be replaced in another style, there is a solid rock of building which contains the government offices. The king and Artois knew nothing of the needs and requirements of the France they revisited after a lapse of 30 years. Since their departure, the country had been subject to many a phase of power: the Republic, the Reign of Terror, the Directory, the Consulate, the Empire, and had survived them all thanks to the admirable civil service working steadily in the background. And fortunately, there still remained in France 2 ministers who had been through most of these administrations, men of great capacity, one of whom at least had the advantage of being personally known to the allied sovereigns. These were Talleyrand and Fouché. The King of France refused at first the services of Fouché, who had voted the death of Louis XVI and was in part responsible for the massacre of the royalists at Lyons under the Terror. But he accepted the ministry of Talleyrand, a man of birth and breeding, on whom B.P. This was the king's graceful fashion of alluding to his predecessor, Buona Parte, had conferred no additional honour when he dubbed him Prince of Benevento. Talleyrand had been for 25 years a moving force in French history. We saw him first on the Champ de Mars, when, as Bishop of Autun, he said the Mass of Federation before the king and the assembled people. A little later he organized for the Constituent Assembly a scheme of popular education. Next he was Danton's colleague and collaborator. Under Robespierre he had fallen into disgrace, and no circumstance could better have favoured his fortunes in 1814. He had been a pillar of the Directory, and yet he had helped to overthrow it in order to establish the consulate. In 1797 he was Bonaparte's counsellor and confidant. Between them they arranged the invasion of Egypt, and throughout the first glorious years of empire Talleyrand had administered the conquests of Napoleon. Then came their quarrel in 1810, and here was Talleyrand back again and the Emperor at Elba. Talleyrand had now in front of him the most difficult task of all his career. After a preliminary treaty at Paris, it was decided that the sovereigns and statesmen of Europe should meet in Congress at Vienna in order to divide among themselves the spoils of Napoleon's empire. The Allied armies in their thousands continued to occupy France, while the French continued to hold some 50 European citadels, including such strong places as Hamburg, Antwerp, Mantua, the fortresses of Belgium, the Rhine and Piedmont. There was still the magnificent remnant of the French army. It is just possible that the country might have made better terms than were offered for the Treaty of Paris. But France panted for peace with a sort of exasperation. The foreign armies were there in possession: Cossacks, Russians, Austrians, Croats, Germans, Prussians, English. Dangerous tenants, each with their wrongs to avenge. It was better, if possible, to remain with them on amicable terms. Besides, Talleyrand's manner was seldom the manière forte. He was yielding, insidious, perfidious, claiming nothing, yet little by little filching, appropriating a great deal. Nothing could have been humbler than his advent at the Congress of Vienna. He was no longer the brilliant host, the great statesman of the Rue Saint-Florentin, who had housed the Emperor Alexander as his guest. The abjection of France was expressed in his very mien. He represented a sort of poor relation of the great powers whose bankruptcy was putting them to a great deal of trouble. Humble, serviceable, amiable, Talleyrand was content with anything they offered. His great phrase was, "La France ne demande rien." In the ambassador's saloon the four great powers, England, Austria, Russia, Prussia, confabulated apart. By an insolent protocol they had arranged that they alone should distribute the spoils of Napoleon, while France, so to speak, was left to wait outside in the hall with Spain, Portugal, Sardinia, Naples, the Netherlands, Bavaria, Württemberg, Saxony, Denmark, and Sweden. In this humiliation Talleyrand found his opportunity. He reverted to the classic policy of France, the policy of Richelieu, which always has been to constitute the King of France the champion and elder brother of the smaller sovereigns. And as Richelieu had opposed this following of small states to the mighty agglomerations of Austria and Spain, so Talleyrand intended to counterbalance the foreign council by a sort of league or entente of the lesser thrones. Who on some country hillside has not seen the kestrel or the cuckoo put to flight by a flock of doves or swallows? The true policy of France has always been to neutralize, ruin, or disperse the great agglomerations in order to secure the advantage of the secondary powers. While Talleyrand consulted his companions in exclusion, the mighty four, who thought to dispose of Europe at their own sweet will, found it increasingly difficult to agree among themselves. A general conflagration appeared imminent. The King of Prussia wanted Saxony, which Russia was half inclined to let him have in exchange for his share of Poland. Austria meant at all costs to regain her suzerainty in Italy. Talleyrand, as spokesman of the smaller powers, could not have cornered a united four. He found them almost at daggers drawn, and profited by the occasion to reintroduce France into the upper room on equal terms as a welcomed fifth, welcomed, that is, by two of the disputants. While he organized with a view to balancing the friendship between Russia and Prussia, a new and surprising entente between Austria, England, and France. A war between the two leagues appeared close at hand. Bavaria, Württemberg, and the Netherlands signified their adhesion to the Franco-Austrian-English alliance. The coalition of the four is destroyed, wrote Talleyrand to Louis XVIII. France marches with two of the greatest powers in Europe, with three secondary states, and others will join us. All those whose principles and maxims are opposed to the revolution. France is the soul and the leader of a union formed to put in practice the principles she has proclaimed. In fact, Talleyrand was radiant, so far as that cold and distant face could reveal an emotion. But one evening in March, at a ball given by Metternich, he was seen to turn paler than ever. He had received news, troublesome, distracting news. It was evident that the cards would have to be reshuffled. Indeed, when he had imparted this surprising message, there was an end of all debate and rivalry between the powers, who during 6 months had quarrelled and bargained interminably. There was some question of war indeed, but not war among themselves. The lion had got loose. Napoleon was in France. End of section 39. Section 40 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 5, The 100 Days. One day at the Congress of Vienna, so the story goes, the statesmen there assembled were discussing anxiously the unrest in Italy, when Lord Wellington, seated beside a great round table on which was spread a map of Europe, cast his eyes negligently over the chart of Italy. "Good God!" he exclaimed, "how close Bonaparte is to the Italian coast! There will be no peace in Lombardy so long as he is at Elba." Was it, as Savary, Duke of Rovigo, declares in his memoirs, a foreign officer, an admirer of Napoleon, who left Vienna for Elba in order to tell the Emperor that the Allies contemplated moving him further afield? Was it the Prince Eugene, betraying the confidence of Alexander, who informed his stepfather of a project in the air? The transportation of Napoleon was a theme so openly debated at Vienna that the news of it may have reached him from more sources than one. At any rate, it is certain that he believed in a plot either to assassinate him or to kidnap him on the part of the Allies. He had abducted so many persons himself that he knew the scheme might enter the sphere of practical politics. Was he to suffer the fate of the Duc d'Enghien? Napoleon had occupied the first months of his exile in organizing Elba. He was there, like Prospero in his isle, like the prophet in his chamber on the wall, just on the marge of a world which he did not cease to survey. But funds soon ran short. The yearly 2 million of francs guaranteed by the Allies were never paid, for the canny King Louis XVIII took a malign pleasure in letting the ex-usurper taste the pleasures of poverty and exile. Chacun son tour. Napoleon had to borrow from a banker in Genoa the sum which permitted him to fortify his isle, place batteries along the coast, improve its artillery, and lay in a store of provisions and ammunition. The Allies and their press gang should have no easy task. This occupied a week or two. Then time again began to drag. "My island is very small," sighed the Emperor of Elba. No news of wife or son, but his mother and the lovely silly sister he preferred came to keep him company. They brought news. News indeed percolated through from every quarter. How unpopular the Bourbons were, how the Allies meant to drive Murat from Naples, how Austria was regaining all the old ground in Italy, how France was as priest-ridden, the nobles as powerful, the people as dissatisfied as if the revolution had never taken place. One-sided, inaccurate news enough, but it served to occupy and to infuriate the exile. Meanwhile, in Milan, the malcontents cried "Vive l'Empereur!" and did not mean the Emperor of Austria. and in France they cried Vive le Roi, and added low, De Rome. On the 22nd of February, 1815, a certain Monsieur Fleury de Chaboulon arrived in the island of Elba and had a long interview with Napoleon. The Emperor saw him again on the morrow. This talk with Fleury was doubtless only the last drop that causes the vase to overflow. Napoleon was already at an end of his patience. The same impulsive temperament which had made him hurry on so many an event, rush into the hall at St. Cloud during the deliberation of the 500, risk his life by his return from Egypt when he ran the blockade, gallop home so often from Spain or Russia on receipt of bad news, now sent him on a more tremendous quest before the times were ripe. How mad an enterprise to dare with the 900 men of his guard the united armies of Europe, all still maintaining on a footing of war and mobilized, when the nations assembled at Vienna had so many causes of quarrel among themselves as would supply half a dozen international conflicts. Had Napoleon known how to possess his soul in patience until his enemies were safely by the ears, he might yet have died a regnant monarch. Had I waited 12 hours longer, he said on St. Helena to Montholon, I should have been in possession of news which would have caused me to delay. But his genius was of a sort which is not a long patience. Buffon's definition was not true of him. Had I waited 15 days, the news of my arrival would no longer have found the sovereigns all assembled in Vienna. But his nature was such that on the very morrow of that conversation with Fleury, in which he had fixed his departure for the 1st of April, he set sail for France with 900 soldiers at his disposal, in the solitary gunboat which composed his navy, and 3 small trading vessels at anchor in the port. It was the 26th of February. On the way they passed a French cruiser that remarked nothing extraordinary in their trim. "How's the Emperor?" shouted the captain, seeing they hailed from his island, where there is a considerable trade in iron. Napoleon seized the speaking tube. "Oh, he's all right," he replied. "Il va à merveille." His spirits and his hopes were high. The sequel sounds like a page from the Légende des siècles. The landing near Cannes, the bivouac in a garden of olives, the startled peasants hurrying to the scene, and the village mayor who says reproachfully to Napoleon, "We were just beginning to enjoy our peace and quietness, and here you come to disturb and unsettle us again." Words, added the Emperor, which pierced me to the heart. And then the apparition of the courier of the Prince of Monaco, who comes riding by in his gold-laced vest. Napoleon recognizes him as an old equerry of Josephine's, and inquires of him as to his probable chances. "The workmen and the soldiers are for you," says the horseman, "but not the others, and don't count on Provence." In order to see how the land lies, the Emperor dispatches to Antibes 25 grenadiers under an officer, to announce his return and bid the garrison open their gates. But the time drags on. The grenadiers are seen no more of, being detained in prison at Antibes. Then comes the Prince of Monaco in person, astonished to find himself of so much importance vis-à-vis to Napoleon. "Where are you going?" "Home," said the little prince. "So am I," said Napoleon. His opinion asked, the prince prophesies no easy triumph, but civil war, the people being for Napoleon, the governing and intellectual classes for the king. Then the Emperor leaves the plains, the rich disaffected country, and takes to the mountains, making for Grenoble, the cradle of the Revolution. There he is received with enthusiasm. Next at Lyons, and on the 20th of March at 4 o'clock in the morning, just 11 months after his sad farewell to the Old Guard, he arrives at Fontainebleau. His 900 soldiers had not yet discharged a single rifle. Until the middle of the month, the king in Paris was treating B.P.'s escapade with sovereign indifference. When the aerial telegraph brought to Paris the news of Napoleon's arrival in Provence, the king tossed aside the dispatch, Take this paper to the Minister of War and tell him to do what's necessary. The necessary being evidently to set the madman against the nearest wall and order a platoon to shoot. It's a plot, said the king. It's a conspiracy, said the court. It would have been folly, they said, to feel the least uneasiness. Next thing they heard Napoleon was at Lyons. On the 15th of March the king announced to the two chambers that on the morrow he would communicate his intentions. A throne was prepared in the Palais Bourbon. The king, the royal family, the marshals, the ministers in the two chambers were united. Louis XVIII arose and in an affecting speech declared that he would gladly give his life to defend the Charter and the Constitution, which at last had brought liberty to France. J'ai revu ma patrie, j'ai travaillé au bonheur de mon peuple. Pourrais-je à 60 ans mieux terminer ma carrière qu'en mourant pour sa défense? These words were received with a storm of enthusiasm. The king and his brother embraced. The princes and the legislators cried as with one voice, "We will live and die for the king and the Constitution." And no doubt Louis's instinct would have led him to stay in Paris, but his lymphatic, indifferent nature made him often the tool of his ministers. If he had stayed in Paris, it is doubtful if Napoleon would have gained an entrance there. But those about the king thought too much of his safety and too little of his honour. After all, it was natural. Louis XVIII was the brother of the unhappy Louis XVI. So at midnight on the 19th of March, the royal travelling coach drew up before the Pavillon de Flore, and the old king left the Tuileries, infirm and suffering sorely from his gout, leaning heavily on the arms of his ministers. The night was wild and wet, the rain fell in torrents, the wind extinguished the flaring light of the torches. Louis would have no escort. Alone he set out in the darkness at the full speed of his equipage for Flanders, where he made a halt at Lille, and finally for the town of Ghent. 24 hours after this midnight flitting, Napoleon slept in the king's bed in Paris. Thus, in 20 days' journey, without a shot fired, the emperor exchanged his villa in Elba for the Tuileries. It is perhaps the most wonderful expedition in all history. But from the moment of his entry into Paris, Napoleon felt a certain chill fall across the quality of his greeting. Throughout the 100 days he was never completely sure of Paris. Under the Charter, Paris had tasted of liberty. The stifling despotism, the forced assent, the mailed fist of the imperial administration had been removed, and Paris, quick-witted, critical, sensitive, artistic Paris, had breathed again and had soon accepted the Bourbons. What did it matter if they were a little ridiculous? The fat king in his red velvet gaiters, the awkward, mannish Dauphine in her straight up-and-down white English frocks and unbecoming close bonnet, they were good, honest folk who let a petulant city say its say. Paris had no great wish to go to school again. In fact, the France of 1814 had two faces like Janus, the one looking toward the past, the other eagerly envisaging the future. There was a popular, heroic France, the child of the Revolution, the heir of the Empire, patriotic to the innermost fibre of the soul, martial and simple, which was mortified to the quick by the invasion of the Allies. To this France, Louis XVIII was odious. But there was a new France whose eager appetites were not all for glory, a France which, after the huge interruption of the Revolution and the Empire, longed to resume the tasks and experiments in letters, in science, in industrial organization, which had occupied the middle years of Louis XVI. In 1814 the steamboat existed already in America. In 1814 George Stephenson was constructing his iron horse. In 1814 James Watt was elected a member of the Académie des Sciences in Paris. There was a France intensely occupied with spinning jennies and chemical experiments, that dreamed of vast factories and the renewal of the world by organized industry. There was a France, voiced by Chateaubriand and Madame de Staël, who knew itself capable of a magnificent revival in art and literature, a France that felt itself the equal of the classic age, though so long curbed and stifled and silenced by the Empire. And this France dreaded and hated Napoleon, because its ideal was beauty, culture, wealth, prosperity, and peace. If sometimes this France had dreamed of a change of dynasty, it was not in favour of the Emperor. At most, the infant King of Rome under a complacent regency. Better still, the Duke of Orleans, young Louis Philippe, whom everyone declared so charming, so wise, so liberal. The sovereigns and statesmen assembled at Vienna were much of the same way of thinking. Louis XVIII. Was held to have disqualified himself by abandoning his kingdom in the hour of need. Besides, he had grievously offended the Czar in 1814 by what Alexander deemed his Bourbon insolence. The autocrat of Russia had offered his sister as a bride for the heir of the French throne, and Louis had let him understand that the Romanovs were people of no birth, that the princess was a heretic or at least a schismatic, and that there was madness in her family. Alexander was already considerably disenchanted when, in the spring of 1815, he learned at Vienna that plan of Talleyrand and King Louis to found an alliance between England, France, and Austria, an alliance evidently intended to keep Russia in her proper place. Small wonder, then, if the Czar envisaged a new arrangement of the monarchy in France. He inclined to the candidature of Louis Philippe. Other powers supported the King of Rome. As for Napoleon, all agreed that he was impossible. Meanwhile, the Emperor was making his last desperate bid for success. His eagles, which had flown from village spire to village steeple all the way from Cannes to the capital, had, as Chateaubriand puts it, fallen exhausted among the chimney stacks of the Tuileries. Napoleon in Paris perceived that he was no longer the idol of the nation. His one chance was to conciliate the malcontents of every party, until by some brusque act of power he could bind them or fuse them in a party of his own. He went warily at first, much as he had pensively picked his path in politics on his return from Egypt, striving to accommodate the imperialists of the army, the republicans of the working class, and even those anarchists of every shade whom in his heart he held in horror. Soon, too soon no doubt, he showed his hand. On the 23rd of April he published an additional act to the constitution of the Empire, an act which was in fact under another name, the Charter of Louis XVIII. Here, he seemed to say, am I, a constitutional monarch, quite reconciled with liberty and peace. Behold me at the head of a parliamentary government, perfectly ready to march with the times. It was but a means of gaining time. The Emperor confessed in later years that had Waterloo been a glorious victory for the French, he would soon have sent his chambers to the right about. And even as an expedient, it proved a poor tool. The patriots were disgusted. They had hoped for a republic. The army was alarmed at this extension of the civil power. The Bonapartists deplored all these liberal concessions and said Napoleon was growing old. And the monarchists and the liberals were neither convinced nor conciliated. The Emperor felt with a sense of bewildered insecurity that his magic worked no more. His old prestige had vanished. Still, a great victory which would avenge France and redeem the long humiliation of the past year might renew the charm and re-establish the power. Napoleon was not without hope that he might yet detach Austria and England from the circle of his enemies. He too had heard of that projected league, the last word of confidential diplomacy, and like most such mysteries, the secret of Polichinelle, Punch's secret that everybody knows. To Austria, therefore, and to England he wrote protesting his desire to keep the peace and his acceptance of the restricted frontiers of France. But neither emperor nor king would take his word. So then he must fight them all. And where was his army? Louis XVIII. Had left the treasury full. Not in vain had he practised a policy of peace and retrenchment. France is naturally so rich and so economical a country that if her sovereigns will but leave her alone, she recovers, incredibly soon, from the most savage bleedings of her army surgeons. So after one brief year of Louis's humdrum calm there was no lack of money. And neither would there be any lack of men, for every Frenchman is born a soldier, if time were granted to equip and train the troops. Napoleon reckoned that by the 1st of October he could place in the field an army of 800,000 or 900,000 men. Unhappily for him, Europe was armed to the teeth. What a specially bad time he had chosen to come back! By the middle of May, Blücher was on the Meuse and Wellington on the Scheldt. The Russians were expected on the Rhine in June, and Lord Castlereagh was telling the Commons that first and last the coalition could count on 1,200,000 soldiers. Already more than half of this number were ready to strike. Napoleon had in hand between 500,000 and 600,000, of which not half were fully armed, instructed, and equipped. Many were absent in foreign garrisons. Not 200,000 were in France, ready to take the field. And of these he had to detach 30,000 men to quell a new rising in Vendée. But could he wait? Could he let the enemy cross the frontier and begin over again the campaign in France? It was clearly his best chance to beat the Prussians and the English before Austria and Russia were ready to take the field. Napoleon was a master of speed, secrecy, surprise. Notwithstanding the overwhelming numbers of the Allies, it was just possible that he might succeed, pouncing suddenly on the two adversaries, crashing right through their point of junction, falling on them, so to speak, with both fists, and hammering hard till one fell stunned to the right and t'other to the left. This bold and brilliant plan was probably the best that a small, highly trained force could execute against two large but less coherent armies. But it needed the Napoleon of yesterday. And Napoleon was no longer that. He had no longer the same force, the same passion, the same power of work. He had come back from Elba immensely fat, discursive, somnolent, oddly acquiescent in the slackness, the baseness, the faint-hearted treacheries of mediocre men. Things that would have driven him to fury in 1810 now scarcely awoke a smile. He knew that Fouché was betraying him to his enemies, yet he found it convenient to retain Fouché as Minister of Police. He trusted very few, if any, of his marshals. Had they not all abandoned him? But he worked with them without reproach. His indulgence was infinite. In fact, Napoleon was growing old. He was in his 46th year. Nevertheless, in flashes, the old genius illuminated him still. The old unmatched decision, mastery, and brilliance. The sudden silent swoop with which he brought his armies across the frontier. The manner with which he arrayed this vast ambush, masked by low hills and the frontier fortresses, within a few leagues of an unsuspecting enemy, are worthy of his inspired campaigns. On the 14th of June, 1815, 115,000 men, 350 cannon, were drawn up, unrevealed, between Philippeville and Maubeuge, and if, on the morrow, the treason of General Bourbons revealed their presence to the Prussians, the English were still unprepared. End of section 40. Section 41 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 6, Waterloo, Part 1. In order to understand the fight at Waterloo, it is better, I think, not to have visited the field of battle, which I remember 40 years ago as a pleasant rolling plain. Landscapes change, and here the cannon, the woodsman's axe, the plough have been at work. In 1815, all the country round Saint-Amand was so thick with trees that it appeared a forest when looked at from a distance, a land of bosky fields, deep lanes, and hidden villages, admirable as a cover for troops. These wide wavy valleys, which follow each other like billows and rise to the forest of Soignes, appeared deeper far when their ridges were fringed with trees. It was through a wooded country that Napoleon crept invisible, till on the 16th of June he fell on the Prussians just beyond Fleurus, as the panther springs on his prey. His plan, as we know, was to attack the Allies at the point where their forces joined, to cut them in two as one cuts through the waist of a hornet, to fling the British on Hal and the Prussians on Tongres, and then, rushing on Brussels before they had recovered that first stunning blow, to throw the Germans beyond the Rhine and the English into the sea. After that the Emperor could reflect and determine what to do next. Ligny is the first act of Waterloo. Early in the morning on that 16th of June the cannon boomed 3 times in the direction of Fleurus. That deep salutation was succeeded by the strains of fife and drum, a great noise of singing, an endless acclamation, a prolonged roar which, as it approached Saint-Amand, resolved itself into the words "Vive l'Empereur!" The Prussians, hidden in the bosky hedges and orchards of the village, remained motionless, silent, until the first line of the French was seen nearing the church and the graveyard. Then the invisible Germans let loose, as with one rifle, a rolling fire of musketry. The French dashed on in a superb bound forward, and soon every barn, garden, outhouse was a scene of carnage, and men were knifing each other's ribs with unfixed bayonets in a struggle too close for rifle fire, from the eaves to the cellars of every cottage in Saint-Amand. This first day's fight could only be what it was: a thundering onset, a crashing attack, a position carried by decision and surprise. Blücher and his 80,000 men were thrown back from Saint-Amand and Ligny, having suffered terrible losses. Their retreat left the English flank uncovered, and Wellington was forced to withdraw in good order on Waterloo. The furious cannonade of Ligny had surprised the English. Wellington was not quick or ready. The Battle of Waterloo is the battle of the hare and the tortoise. On the very day when Napoleon entered Belgium, Wellington was writing a long dispatch to the Emperor Alexander, proposing a new plan of campaign for the invasion of France. Little did he dream that his enemy was already in the gate. On the eve of Ligny he still suspected nothing, and it was at the Duchess of Richmond's ball in Brussels that the English commander-in-chief and his staff learned the news of Napoleon's presence between Charleroi and Ligny. But which of us does not remember the scene in Vanity Fair and in the Dynasts? Ligny, one of the most terrible battles of the century, was a victory for the French and might have been a decisive victory, but for a lack of energy and coherence in the carrying out of Napoleon's command, which was to have a sequel infinitely more important on the morrow. The French army, though it contained a great proportion of conscripts, had never been more ardent, braver. And Ney, Grouchy, Soult, d'Erlon, Gérard had fought victoriously on many a field beside their emperor. What had robbed them now of their speed, their decision, their self-assurance, their certitude of victory? Was it the defeat and capitulation of 1814? Was it that they had, if not betrayed, at least abandoned a year ago their emperor, their general of today? Or was it the absence of Berthier, Prince of Wagram? Berthier was no thunderbolt of war, no genius. He was the administrator of the battlefield. He saw that the orders were clear, that they were duly carried, in sufficient doubles, that one officer or more shot down by the way did not stop communications between the centre and the wings. He was an admirable major general. Waterloo was perhaps lost by Napoleon for lack of the inconspicuous Berthier. On a souvent besoin d'un plus petit que soi. But Berthier, like the other marshals, had capitulated to the Bourbons, and on his master's sudden return would not, like Soult and Ney, forsake the king for the emperor, nor like Marmont and Macdonald immolate Napoleon to the Bourbon king. Inextricably torn between his honour and his conscience, Berthier had refused to take either part, and had retired to Bamberg, where on the 1st of June, just one fortnight before Waterloo, he had been mysteriously murdered by masked assassins. On which side did his ghost call down vengeance? Soult, who assumed Berthier's customary charge at Ligny and Waterloo, was a general of rare military talent and a wise administrator, but one of those maundering, pedantic talkers who think any sharp, precise contour in speech incompatible with dignity. Instead of saying, "Send Erlon here," "Bid Ney go there," he indulged in generalities. Confusion was the result. General d'Erlon was sent from pillar to post, and during the whole arduous day at Ligny wandered up and down the battlefield, bringing his men to and fro, back and forth between Napoleon and Ney, without placing them at the disposal of either. Worse still, acting on his own discretion in disobedience to orders, put off the attack on Quatre Bras, where the Prince of Orange and Wellington were blocked with scarce 8,000 soldiers, until the Anglo-Belgians had time to bring up 50,000 more. Worst of all was the inexplicable inaction of Grouchy, who, after prodigies of valour at Ligny, remained as it were stunned and passive during the 2 succeeding days. It was to this extraordinary attack of military paralysis that Napoleon himself attributed his defeat at Waterloo. Thus it happened that, owing to inefficient staff work, Napoleon had been obliged to fight at Ligny without Erlon's force, indeed without a single man from Ney's command. The Prussians had been forced to retreat, but they were not annihilated as they should have been. Indeed, they were not as damnably mauled as Wellington said and Napoleon supposed. On the morning after Ligny, the rain fell in torrents. Perhaps some day our physicists will tell us why it always rains after a great artillery attack. So far they have either denied the circumstance or murmured something vague concerning the ionization of the clouds. Waterloo, at all events, was no exception to the rule. The roads were so deep in mire that it was impossible to move the artillery much before noon. Yet the whole problem for Napoleon was a question of time. Could he get at the English before the remains of the Prussian forces had time to recover and come to their assistance? The great thing was to learn which road had been followed by the German general in that retreat, which was not, as Napoleon still hoped and supposed, a rout. Grouchy, with 36,000 men, was told off to pursue the enemy, and at all hazards to prevent his junction with the British. But Grouchy, after a march of 5 miles or so, stopped still, wasted all this day of the 17th. It is true the weather was so appalling that the troops in their rain-soaked clothes could barely move through the mud, and even when they moved, could barely see. Napoleon's chief fear was that the English would escape behind the forest of Soigny or Soignes. But the English had no thought of escaping. Wellington massed his men solidly and squarely in front of the forest on the strong position of the Mont Saint-Jean, a low eminence 11 miles south of Brussels, and there he waited. Late on the evening of that wasted day, the 17th, Napoleon paced his camp with the faithful Bertrand, turning in his mind many sombre thoughts and fears of a possible aggression of the Austrians from beyond the Rhine. When he saw, as he thought, a forest fire in the direction of Soigny, it was the bivouac of the British soldiers, who under the pouring rain were trying to dry their coats before their smoky fires of green wood hacked from the trees. At 5 in the morning on the 18th of June, a pale ray of sun lit up the sky, and the Emperor knew a gleam of joy. "We have 80 chances out of 100, he exclaimed. But the roads were still too wet for the guns. The battle had to be put off until almost noon. Napoleon's plan was to throw himself with the full force of his right on the English left, hammer at them and throw them off the Brussels road, while at the same time shutting off the chance of retreat through the forest of Soigny. On his extreme right, Grouchy with his 36,000 men was to keep off the Prussians and bring up a reserve if wanted. On the left, Reille was to attempt a diversion on the farm of Hougoumont, a little in advance of the British right. Meanwhile, Wellington awaited his attack. The decision to defend the Mont Saint-Jean was taken upon the assurance of Prussian help. The British commander had learned that Blücher's army was concentrated at Wavre, a large village which lies some 13 miles north of the field of Waterloo, and that he might count on them to open on the French right somewhere about noon on the 18th. Napoleon supposed the Prussians in full retreat to the east, harried in their rear by Grouchy's division. Had he suspected that 90,000 Prussians were within 4 hours' march, and proposed relieving Wellington in the course of the day, he would never have waited until 35 minutes past 11 in the morning before launching his attack on the Duke. End of section 41. Section 42 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Part 4, Chapter 6, Waterloo, Part 2. At 1 o'clock, as the Emperor on his mound swept the horizon with his field glass in search of Grouchy's missing reserve, he saw a moving shadow. Not French? Prussians? Yes, Bülow's corps, who had not served at Ligny. It was, he thought, but a single unsupported body, which, if Grouchy moved rapidly, might be caught between two fires and annihilated. But Grouchy was not in sight, and these ominous Prussians, waiting and watching for the advent of Blücher's more considerable corps, hovered on the rear of the battle, still waiting, like a flock of vultures. Perhaps at that moment Napoleon ought to have disengaged his armies, retreated as Blücher had done at Ligny, left the ultimate issue for a happier hour. But was it possible? What reinforcements had he to hope for? Delay was all in favour of the Allies. Their reinforcements were the innumerable hosts of Austria and Russia. Besides, the struggle was already begun. French and English were at each other's throats in an inextricable medley. The crashing charge of Erlon's division at 1 o'clock left the British infantry unshaken. Then came the turn of Milhaud and his cuirassiers. Who does not know the story of their splendid onset as they stormed the Mont Saint-Jean, riding like centaurs, 3,000 centaurs, 3,000 grizzled heads shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" Who has not heard how, in the full shock of their furious charge, they came on that sunken lane, the ravine of Ohain, and fell one on top of another in the horrible trap? But the middle ranks and the last gained the plateau on the other side, charging like mad, carrying all before them, the tails of their horses swishing through the tall wheat. Colonel Soult, with 6 sabre cuts in his right arm, dismounts while the army surgeon amputates it, and then leaps on his horse again and leads his men to the attack. The Duke of Wellington told me himself, says Jomini in his Campagne de 1915, he told me at Verona, that in all his experience of war he never saw anything more magnificent than the charge of the French cuirassiers at Waterloo. At that moment it was to no French confrère that the Duke was imparting his impressions, but to the incomparable British infantry who withstood the wild onslaught. "Steady, boys," he says. "What will they say of us at home if we are beaten?" There was no thought of giving way. The English never knew when they were beaten. The battle was won by men whose motto has ever been, "'Tis dogged as does it." The French cavalry was as close to us as our own troops, wrote the Iron Duke a little later to Lord Beresford. The moment came when the 5th British Division, reduced from 4,000 to 400 men, could no longer hold its position. and Wellington, seeing his brave soldiers hacked in pieces all round him, told them to fall where they stood, and never thought of yielding an inch of ground, though, as he sighed, Night or Blücher alone can save us. Meanwhile, Napoleon was in no less terrible straits. Ney, mad with battle, had led his cavalry charge too soon, at 3:30. The exhaustion of the horses made a further attack appear as yet impossible, and the English cannon had found the range. There were now great moth-eaten spaces and holes in the vast furry mass of the French busbies. But the first British line is pierced, the second broken, though the third is intact. Oh, for a good solid regiment of infantry! Ney sends to Napoleon in utmost haste. De l'infanterie, the Emperor answers. Que voulez-vous que j'en prenne? Voulez-vous que j'en fasse? And just as Wellington scans the landscape for a sign of Blücher, he looks anxiously round. Still no trace of Grouchy and his men. They might have disappeared in an earthquake. But the army does not yet guess at the Emperor's anguish. The French soldiers had begun to cry Victoire. A messenger was riding post-haste to Ghent to apprise Louis XVIII of the defeat of the Allies, when that cloud on the horizon began to move. The men cried Grouchy, but the Emperor knew better. It was the Prussian army under Bülow. In order to win the battle, he must, at whatever cost, crush the British before the arrival of Blücher, who was probably somewhere in Bülow's rear. The mass of the French cavalry, 12,000 strong, flung itself again in charge after charge on the English front, carrying at last the English guns, and sweeping with desperate bravery round the unbroken squares whose fire thinned their ranks. Those indomitable squares remained unshaken. Never has greater courage been displayed, either in attack or in endurance. The rivals were equally matched, for if either was to overcome, some new factor must be added to his strength. At 6:30 again that moving shadow on the skyline, and again the soldiers of France shouted Grouchy, Grouchy, but it was the bulk of the Prussian army under Blücher. Then the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's last reserve, which had taken no part in the battle, was drawn up in two huge columns of attack. Ney himself led the first, a Ney transfigured, drunk with battle and despair, covered with mud — he had been thrown from his horse — his coat pierced with bullets, his sleeve torn from the shoulder, and Ney, wild, gesticulating, shouting Vive l'Empereur, and the column sweeping all before it, floundering through heavy fields and pools of water, mounted the rise, touched the English front, and fell back, torn, shattered by the terrible charge of the British musketry. Then broke the second wave, advancing with the same fury, rising, engulfing, only to be repulsed and scattered in its turn. By now it was 9 p.m. Night began to fall. All these brave men had been fighting for 3 days, and at the moment when the Guard fell back exhausted, the French beheld the whole Prussian army massed on Napoleon's right, their guns sweeping the road to Charleroi. Wellington seized that moment to make a desperate advance. Those imperturbable, shattering squares began to move forwards. All round, the French now saw themselves hemmed in by those rows on rows of little red figures, no taller than low hedges, which were the British regiments and divisions, and the troops of the Emperor saw that they were turned. From that hour all was lost. Terror, panic, confusion reigned in the ranks of the French. Whole regiments fled helter-skelter in a wild sauve-qui-peut. But the Emperor's old guard still stood firm in the midst of the increasing darkness. "Surrender!" cried the British in a transport of pity and admiration. "Damn!" screamed the French general Chambrun, for thus I venture to translate the unpronounceable oath which polite historians have paraphrased as "The Guard dies but does not surrender." And with a last cry, "Vive l'Empereur!" the heroic grenadiers rushed headlong on their death. Napoleon was looking on in a sort of stupor. They seem to have broken the ranks, he muttered as he saw his squadrons tumbling head over heels in their mad rout. All was lost, he was to write on the morrow, by a moment of panic terror. And he added with the indulgence of a great captain, "On sait ce que c'est que la plus brave armée du monde, lorsqu'elle est mêlée et que son organisation n'existe plus." The very soldiers at his side were caught in the whirlpool and swept away in that hopeless torrent. Then the Emperor gathered up his reins, and turning his horse, made for the sacrificed phalanx of the guard, and would have entered their column. But Soult, Duke of Dalmatia, laid his hand on the bridle. "Stop, sire. Are not our enemies happy enough already?" Napoleon resists, and is wise to resist, for that would have been his fitting end. But Soult and the generals drag him on the road to Genappe. There for a long moment he sits his horse, silent, motionless, deeply brooding, then orders an artilleryman to fire off his guns, and listens for the last time to that dull roar which has been the music of his life. At last he gives his bridle rein a shake, and sets off alone at full canter for Charleroi. On the 21st of June he was in Paris. He had been 3 days without eating. He was worn out. He had no longer the courage to daunt and dominate the Chambers. Ah, mon cher, j'étais battu. He was no longer the man of Brumaire, and when both houses demanded his abdication, he was too broken to resist. Lavalette, his postmaster general, has left a record of the fearful epileptic laugh with which Napoleon greeted him on the 21st of June. The Emperor saw the game was up. Outside in the streets, the people and the soldiers, 2 regiments and a mob from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, were shrieking, adjuring him not to desert them, beseeching him to lead them against the enemy. Napoleon remained passive, inert. If there was one thing he adored even more than power, it was order. He was afraid of civil war, of revolution. On the 22nd he signed his abdication in favour of his son, the King of Rome. He offered the provisional government to serve France as a simple general under their command. The government refused. Finally, as Blücher's Prussians were reported in the neighbourhood, he left Paris and made his way to the sea. His first idea had been to take refuge in those United States of America which were a second fatherland to the children of the Revolution. But the British cruisers scoured the Atlantic. So, making a virtue of necessity, the tracked and hounded autocrat of yesterday wrote to the Prince Regent announcing that he came, like Themistocles, to seat himself at the hearth of the British people. Ah, why did not the English state, in a mood of generous and judicious irony, offer him that vacant hall of Hartwell where Louis XVIII had passed his term of exile? Instead, as we know to our grief and shame, we stranded him on a sun-baked Devil's Island in mid-ocean, on desolate, dreary St. Helena. That and the flaming stake at Rouen are our 2 crimes in history. We have had our own way of dealing with the heroes and heroines of France, and I think it took the blood we shed of late in Flanders to wipe out the memory of that offence. Not like Themistocles, received with magnificence in Persia by the nobler adversaries of the elder age, like Philoctetes, rather, left to perish on his lonely rock. In the 20-year-long contest between the Revolution and Europe, the dynasts score the final triumph. In France, in Spain, in Naples, the Bourbons reascend their thrones. Louis XVIII comes limping home to France, crutched on the armies of the coalition. 1,200,000 foreign troops again overrun the departments, leaving behind them when they retire, as a flood tide leaves its fringe of mud and weed, an army of occupation. 150,000 foreigners as a sort of royal guard destined to secure the king against a renewal of revolution. The cost of their maintenance was added to the war tax of 700 millions of francs contributed by France to the expenses of the campaign. The insolent, irrepressible country appeared ruined, at least if not reconciled. But military force has never yet been able to long prevent the expansion of a great political ideal, and the task of the 19th century in France was to be the gradual and sure development of the notion of democracy. End of section 42. Section 43 of A Short History of France by Mary Duclos. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Epilogue. Not since Henry VI of England was crowned King of France in Notre Dame had the great nation suffered a humiliation so entire as during that conference of allies which occupied Paris during the summer of 1815, in order to arrange the future of Europe and to assume the government of France. The defeat of 1814 had been nothing compared to this complete abasement. France lay prone, while her enemies yelped and bayed about her, each eyeing some juicy, tender morsel to set its fangs in, snatch asunder, and carry to its lair unreproved. The leanest states were the hungriest and the most pitiless. Prussia and the Germans, greedy beyond all bounds. Nothing was too small for them. They stripped the walls of the public picture galleries. They threatened to blow up the Jena Bridge, memorial of their defeat. "Do as you will," said Louis XVIII. "I warn you, I shall have myself carried onto the bridge in my armchair." And no project for the dismemberment of France appeared to them preposterous. They would fain have had the kingdom occupied for the space of 7 years by an army of 240,000 men. They wanted a war indemnity of 1,200 millions. They claimed French Flanders, Alsace, Lorraine, Savoy, Burgundy, Franche-Comté, part of Champagne, and part of Dauphiné. They wished to separate from the mother country some 4,760,000 souls, and naturally they required the fortresses, Dunkirk, Lille, Metz, Strasbourg, Besançon, Chambéry at least. The very spirit of destruction possessed them. Austria, indifferent, well-bred, looked on, mildly disapproving this excess of Prussian cupidity. For her own part, she was less exacting, proposing merely a return to the historical frontiers of 1790, an indemnity of 600 millions, and the dismantling of the first line of French defences in Flanders and Alsace. Yet she did nothing to oppose the hungrier despoilers, hypocritically benign, secretly not a little ferocious, as is the wont of Austria. The unhappy King of France could do nothing. These furies who spoke of dismembering his kingdom were the allies who had restored his throne. In its secret sessions the conference had drawn up a map of France, of the miserable remnant left when all these avidities should be satisfied. Such mysterious meetings were never so occult as their members imagine. Somehow their dim arcana are generally violated. A copy of the map came into the hands of the old king, sitting forlorn, unfriended in his Tuileries. Louis XVIII, whatever were his faults, never failed in dignity. He sent for the Duke of Wellington, for the Emperor Alexander. He spoke first to the conqueror of Waterloo. "My Lord Duke, I thought on my return to France to reign over the kingdom of my forefathers. It seems that I was mistaken. Will your government, my lord, grant me a refuge if for the second time I ask the hospitality of England?" The impulsive Alexander left the Duke no time to answer. "No, no, your Majesty shall not lose those provinces. I will not suffer it." From that moment, perhaps before, else why did the wise old king send especially for those two representatives of his allies? But at any rate, certainly from that moment, France in her extremity saw two unexpected angels, two miraculous champions, detach themselves from the rout of her oppressors and stand by her side. They were Alexander and Wellington. At first they were much more Alexander and Wellington than Russia and England, but that was to follow. Alexander was an autocrat who summed up in his person all the Russias. But Wellington and Castlereagh had some difficulty and some merit in bringing the English at home round to their point of view. In their chivalrous action, as in Alexander's, there was more than the magnanimity that met the eye. The character of Alexander of Russia is one of the most interesting in modern history. Only a mystic could be at once so dreamily high-minded and so alertly practical, so ingenuous and so shrewd a calculator, so noble and so full of guile. Alexander was the St. Francis Xavier of 19th century politics, more spiritualized than ever in 1815, being under the influence of Madame de Krüdener, and pledged to further the reign of Christ on earth. But for the last year he had looked with suspicion on the new importance of Prussia, of Germany. France, bounding these countries upon their further side, would be an incomparable ally for the government of the Tsar. In the East also, France might prove for Russia an excellent counterpoise to the influence of Great Britain. No, from every point of view, moral or mundane, it was clear that conquered France must not be too much enfeebled. Wellington and Castlereagh, meanwhile, were ruminating thoughts not wholly dissimilar. England, too, might want one day a friend in need, and who so handy as a neighbour? Especially did they dread too close an alliance between France and Russia. The principal arguments of Castlereagh, wrote Gagern, the representative of the Netherlands, are the necessity of keeping Russia within bounds, for Russia has a kindness for France and tends to an alliance, while England seeks to outlive her in generosity and moderation. Mais il y a la manière. Alexander spoke from an impulse of the heart no less than from a deep political calculation. He had never forgotten those words of Talleyrand's at Erfurt: "The French nation is civilized. The sovereign of Russia is civilized. Let the Emperor of Russia be the ally of the people of France." Alexander felt a moral duty of protection toward the French, and in his then mood of vicar of Christ on earth, we may suppose that he regarded the distressful country as his lost sheep, whom he would bring back to the fold on his shoulder. After all these years, the accents of his arguments are moving, as he complains of the Germans who degrade the cause of the Allies by their violence and their vengeance, their unmannerly avarice, their pretensions to Alsace and Lorraine. Les Alsaciens répugnent à devenir Allemands. I entirely share your Majesty's opinion as to the extravagant character of the Prussian proposals, chimed in the Duke of Wellington. The Duke's task was not light, for, as I have said, he had to convert his government at home, and, above all, to sway and manage that tremendous force, the British public, inclined to look on the French as a sort of Catholic heathen, little better than cannibals in manners and morals. "Take something," wrote Lord Liverpool. Wellington took as little as he could, filched a few works of art, and that with so bad a grace that he set the French against him, while he barely calmed the folks at home. But in essentials, no less than Alexander, he stood the friend of France. "L'Angleterre ne veut pas qu'il arrive de mal à la France," complains the German diplomatist Gneisenau in a letter to the poet Arndt, and he scarce knows what to argue from une pareille perversité. But Wellington stood firm. He had not Alexander's mystical magnanimity, but he had a sportsman's liking for fair play, a soldier's fellowship for the adversary he had found it so hard to beat, a gentleman's dislike for the avarice of the Germans. Both he and Castlereagh wrote to Lord Liverpool that the prosperity of France was England's advantage. Thanks to England and Russia, France was not dismembered. She lost but a recent acquisition, Savoy, and a few frontier fortresses not of the first rank. These last, which were French since Louis XIV, being cruel sacrifices. Still mauled and mulcted, France was left alive, with all her limbs and all her faculties organically perfect. Here let me quote again that verse of Ronsard's, which I have printed in my second flyleaf. Le Gaulois semble au sol verdissant. Plus on le coupe, et plus il est naissant, et rejetonne en branche davantage, prenant vigueur de son propre dommage. The Gaul is like the verdant willow bush. The more you prune, the more it's lithe and lush, shooting a crown of branchy twigs all round, and draws new life and vigour from a wound. We know what life, what vigour our pruned laurel, France, was to find in the 19th century. In art, in letters, for just as we take leave of her, the first romantics arrive on the horizon. In science, too, with Lamarck, Leverrier, Claude Bernard, Pasteur, and the rest. In industry, in social science, and also in politics, tending ever more and more, as her history evolves, to that alliance which was foreshadowed more than 100 years ago in the tragic Paris of 1815. End of section 43. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D. in Encino, California, November 2021. End of A Short History of France from Caesar's Invasion to the Battle of Waterloo by Mary Duclos.